Hey, hello, this is Matt Bergman, and you are listening to the Punk Rock Libertarians podcast, episode 112. I'm here tonight with Jared Schneiderman.
Yo, yo.
Big Eth.
Ahoy.
And once again, you were on here before, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And we've got Kyle Wagner up in this bitch.
Hello.
Whoa.
Yeah, dude. So Kyle, you're the champion of many Facebook groups I've seen.
I wouldn't say champion. None of them are fan pages. They're all hater pages. So like,
So
that's
Kyle,
the best kind.
So Kyle Wagner is a goddamn communist. Is not a fan page.
No, that one's a group. I'm not in it, but yeah, there's a bunch of them. It started with shit Kyle says or shit Kyle Wagner says. I forget what that was the original page. There's Kyle Wagner's a goddamn communist. There's Kylosphere. And then there's like maybe 2 or 3 other ones. It's just unbelievable how much hate I get on Facebook.
Why do you get so much hate, dude?
Well, I'm a minarchist, so and
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, so I really became an outspoken minarchist, and I've been attacking anarcho-capitalism and ANCAPs and debating them, and I guess they just got agitated and they started memeing me, and now there are like thousands of Kyle memes. It's like a thing where they cut my head out and put it on all kinds of different pictures, like ridiculous pictures.
How does it feel to be a meme? What is that like?
Dude, you gotta admit, it's pretty hilarious.
Yeah, it is. It's actually reached the next level. Some ANCAPs have started selling products with my face. There's a T-shirt that just came out. There's mugs and and then my friend, like I have some friends that.
Where can we buy these products?
I think it's like ancapistan.com or something like that. I think I want or .org. I forget, but
Oh my goodness.
yeah, you can buy stuff with my less popular quotes like taxation isn't theft.
Dude, I think we need a picture of Kyle on like a libertarian country T-shirt. What do you think?
Yeah, man.
Yeah, dude.
Yeah.
Wait, do you believe in IP with your minarchism?
Yeah, I think it's debatable, but yes, like I think that especially trademarks, like McDonald's. I don't think you should be able to set up a fake McDonald's with the golden arches and pretend you're a McDonald's when you're not really McDonald's.
Right, but I'm talking more in line of like, do you feel like you should be able to sue these people for using your likeness?
Me personally, I wouldn't do anything like that just because you have to understand, like in the picture, I'm wearing a ski mask and goggles. So like you can't really tell that it's my face.
Okay.
It's just that image from my profile picture became kind of iconic. It was easy to cut out. It's kind of funny looking. I have like this grin because it was a nice day. I was skiing and having fun. And like I have this like snarky looking grin, and like this image of my face like with the helmet and goggles just.
Well, so I mean, do you think like you wouldn't like out of principle, or you wouldn't just because like it's not worth it and you don't really care?
Both. I definitely both. Like I don't think they're gonna make any money with any of the products or anything like that. It's all just like it's just next level trolling,
I don't know, man. Dude, I may buy one of these products later on tonight.
Yeah.
Dude. What the hell,
all right,
man?
the T-shirt, it's a communist flag. It's like a communist propaganda poster, not flag, the propaganda poster, and then it's my face, and then on the bottom it says taxation isn't theft.
I
That's
feel like,
pretty amazing.
I feel like there must be like you must feel at least on some level like a sense of honor and pride in being this significant to these people.
A little bit, yeah. It's an honor, I guess.
I guess.
I don't know.
I think that's hilarious.
I
I
would
had
be
no idea.
flattered.
Yeah, it's. I'm flattered. I think it's. I don't know how to feel about it, because it's not like they're my fans, but I don't know.
I mean, I think if nothing else, to be triggering them that bad, like to have that kind of influence over people, for positive or negative, I mean, that's impressive. I mean, I don't know anybody else is getting fucking merchandise made up that's making fun of them. I think that's hilarious.
It started from basically day one when I switched from ANCAP to minarchist. That's another thing about me. I used to be an ANCAP, so like I've what I consider improved or advanced to minarchism. And
I didn't see that on your Grindr profile.
Yeah, and I noticed it right off the first day. I was
Wait,
getting,
you're on
like,
Grindr too, Bergman?
Apparently.
Dude, Ethan showed me. It was on his phone.
It's true. It's true.
I was just getting the most hate, like, right off the bat. I was just really, really nasty comments from ANCAPs, and I was so shocked because I thought we were, like, you know, the more respectful, like, the nicer people.
Thought we were bros.
Yeah, and then, like, they just hated me right off the bat, and it, like, really got intense for a while. And now they've kind of, like, they've accepted that I am what I am.
Oh,
and,
wow. Wow.
Yeah. But,
So I mean, it was really like you were coming out as a minarchist, like, you know, same way like a gay person comes out.
that wouldn't be how I would probably phrase it. But yeah, it was, I came out swinging, you know. I was like, okay, we have to, like, completely take this movement, and I kind of view it as a train, and it's like one rail is off the rails, it's off the tracks, and I was like, we got to put this train back on the tracks. Minarchism is the right path for this movement, so we need, the first obstacle is not conservatives, it's not progressives, it's ANCAPs. Like, we have to get all the ANCAPs to stop, because we're under the same umbrella. You guys are ANCAPs. I'm a minarchist. We're both calling ourselves libertarians. We're spreading a different message. We have a different philosophy.
What did I say I was an ANCAP, dude?
Well, I thought you were.
Dude.
Aren't you?
No, dude.
What are you?
I'd say I'm like an anarchist without hyphens, dude.
Oh,
Even,
wow.
Yeah, I'm a voluntarist, you know?
Okay.
If you want to have a socialist colony, and as long as you're not, like, robbing anybody else, I mean, you're free to do that.
Well, but when you kind of say that, when you say, like, you can do that, like, you have to be in a position of an authority to say what people can and can't do, and to say this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. And the thing with socialism, that's like a completely...
I just stated an opinion.
Okay. But, like, that's a completely different social order, you know, with a different set of laws. If you imagine sports, like, you have football and, like, baseball, you know, or soccer. You can't play the same sport on the same field at the same time because they have different laws. So, like, you would need to have a whole separate country with a border and say, this is socialist law inside this country, and then it's not socialist law outside of this area. That's the only way it would work.
I think even Ron Paul said that you could have socialist sex living in a libertarian society.
Socialist sex. No, I would disagree.
Ron Paul said that, dude.
I know.
I know. Isn't he like your Lord and Savior? Or
I'm
are you
I'm
more status than Ron Paul?
I'm a big Ron Paul fan, but I don't always agree with him, and I don't agree that
When do you differ with the good doctor?
We differ on taxation is theft. We differ.
So, what do you think? You don't think taxation is theft?
No, it's it is compulsory. I don't deny that it's not voluntary and that it's compulsory, but I think of it as like dues. So if you like are in a club, a big club, and they have dues and they impose dues on all the members, everybody has to pay a little bit. And that's your payment for the shared services, public services.
Yeah, but with a club, you can leave that club whenever you want.
Yeah, I mean,
and
but
it's not just, and I know people will say that about
Move to Somalia,
but
yeah.
it isn't the same kind of thing. I mean, a club is, there might be a meeting place over there, and I can join, and I can hang out for a couple months, and then decide that I don't want to be in, and then I don't have to pay dues anymore.
It's a little different with a society because it kind of grows up, and it has established power structures, it has established rules, and you can't offer like every newborn person like, hey, do you want to opt out of our laws? Or every like 18-year-old even, hey, do you want to not be subject to the laws of this country, of this land? There's no way to let people opt out because then they wouldn't be subject to any laws. They'd just be like, I'm not going to play by these rules. I'm going to do whatever the heck I want.
So would you say that your objection to anarcho-capitalism is that to form an actual tangible anarcho-capitalist, to form Ancapistan that is fundamentally in many ways the same as establishing a state insofar as that you have to have borders, you have to have laws that are enforced in some way, and thus is that sort of and thus that it is de facto minarchist in a sense, at least. Is that
it's
sort
hard
of where you're coming from?
It's hard to conceptualize anarcho-capitalism because, in my opinion, it's theoretically impossible. If ANCAPs were to become the dominant faction and create their own sort of area, they would be forcing out the other factions who didn't agree with Ancapistan. So yeah, I guess what you're saying is they would become in effect the new state or the new governing faction of that area. So one thing I want to bring up is like group conflicts. You know, everybody thinks like I could fend off an aggressor. I don't, you know, or I could just buy private security. But what ends up happening with humans is we form these groups, like large groups, factions. You know, progressives, conservatives, nationalists, socialists. We form and organize for strength, for power. You know, as a group, and then these groups fight for dominance over that territory. And that's what ends up happening. So the only way that you have peace is if you have a government over the top that basically imposes by force laws and enforces the laws.
So I guess if I were saying, like, you're sort of saying to have an actual functioning Ancapistan, you know, that is real and tangible, you know, then it fundamentally is a state in a sense, you know. I mean, let's say we have, you know, a piece of territory. It does have borders. Those borders do need to be defended. There do need to be established laws, even if those established laws are, say, natural law, quote unquote.
How are you defining state, though? Because by
that's
definition,
what I'm getting at. Is it sounds like you're saying that basically Ancapistan would fall under the definition of a minarchist state anyway.
I just don't think it's possible at all. Like, it's like you always have to ask the question, well, who says? Well, who says we're going to have Ancapistan? ANCAPs say it. Well, Democrats don't agree with that. Republicans don't agree with that. So in order for you to get the kind of area or country that you want, you actually have to impose your will on them against their will.
But you're not...
Well, I mean, so let's say hypothetically you were seasteading and you just build an island in the middle of the ocean. It has not been previously owned. I mean, I know this is getting far-fetched and is not realistic at all. But I'm just saying, as far as theoretically, you know, let's say we seastead some large island where you could actually fit 500,000 people or something. You know,
who would make the rules for that island? You know, because anytime you get a group of 500,000 people, there's not going to be agreement. Somebody's not going to be happy. Somebody's not going to get their way. It's going to be my way or it's going to be your way.
Sure,
but if our ways are different, that's a conflict. Like, it's not going to be anarchy.
But that's what the whole idea of the non-aggression principle is it's a means of settling the conflict.
Yeah, but people...
And the default of the non-aggression principle would be, you know, as long as... So, like, you have a claim to private property. You have a claim to whatever property you can defend and that you rightfully own. And then from there, so you're bringing in the other groups that maybe like Democrats or socialists that don't really believe in private property. Democrats say they do, but they really don't.
Even the NAP is not universally agreed upon. You know, in fact, it's hotly debated.
But you don't need it to be necessarily universally agreed upon. You just need enough people to agree upon it.
So they can enforce it on the minority who don't agree on it.
Sure.
Yeah, so you're governing them.
But you're not governing them because government requires the initiation of force. I mean, unless you're going to make the argument that property is violence or property is force, and then you're welcome to do that. I'll disagree with you, and that's really a fundamental disagreement that can't... I don't think you can reason out of it.
It's not force, but property is backed by force. You know, state violence
but it's
is
not
like...
the initiation of force, though.
Well, now you're changing what you just said. You changed it from force to initiation of force.
No, I said initiation of force.
All right.
Or maybe I misspoke, but that's what I meant, is the initiation of force.
Well, even when you say initiation of force, it's like if somebody comes on my property, I use nonviolent crimes as examples where you have to initiate force. If somebody defrauds me, they haven't initiated force. If somebody steals from me, they haven't initiated. See, now you're throwing a bunch of peaceful things that aren't really forceful, like trespassing. Like, if somebody walks across my yard, they haven't initiated force. If they're sitting on my yard without my permission...
Well, you're kind of moving the goalposts on what we're calling force.
Yeah, I mean, I just think those are non-forceful activities. Like trespassing,
they're not violent activities, but they're still initiations of force, technically speaking. I mean, you defraud somebody...
It's aggressing against property.
Well, you're changing it to aggression instead of force... But now you're trying to be the one that gets to define what's aggression, what's not aggression. You need to be a lawmaker to say that.
Well, and I say this to be, I think you have some good points, but I think the counter argument would be that the non-aggression principle, and it's been arrived at through logical means, either through Hoppian argumentation ethics. Molyneux has UPB. The point is that these are that natural laws are derived logically. They're not. Legislated. I can't think of the word for like man-made legislation as opposed to natural law. Yeah. So that the argument would be that these are self-evident natural law that can't be argued against. And that's Hoppian argumentation ethics, and UPB relies on this as well, which is that you can't argue against these things without making a contradiction. Thus, these are self-evident natural law that man doesn't need to make up. They just are what they are, because logically there is no other possible conclusion.
That isn't self-contradictory.
I hear that, and there's a meme that you guys have probably seen about spanking your kids. It says, don't spank, like, is your kid old enough to understand reason? If so, then why are you spanking them? You shouldn't be spanking them. You should be reasoning with them. And then if they're not old enough to understand reason, they're not going to know why you're spanking them. That's sort of what the meme is. And the point that I like to make is not everybody responds to reason. Like, it doesn't matter if you tell a bank robber, hey, what you're doing is ultimately harmful for society. This is a violation of the NAP. Like, they don't care. You have to be able to crack down on them. You have to be able to use force, and you have to have enough force to crack down on people that don't respect the NAP or don't respect property rights or don't respect your rules. Antisocial individuals, they need to be governed.
Yeah, well,
right,
because they've violated the self-evident, logic.
I
logically concluded non-aggression.
But
principle.
I feel like we're kind of getting into semantics here. Because there's a difference between, a federal government and then small groups of people that, or like private defense contractors. Not in the sense of like military defense contractors, but like, private protection agencies. Like, that's, you could say they're governments because they're sort of imposing
ANCAP
imposing ANCAP world, but it isn't. I feel like it's a semantical argument. When we argue against a state, we're arguing against something that isn't voluntarily contracted with by even the majority of people, I would argue.
Let me interject. When you talk about these private defense agencies, you're assuming that all these private organizations are going to use violence and force in the way that you think they should or in accordance with the NAP. And what ends up happening is, people are interested in their own self-interest, their own corporation's interest. You get a conflict and it's basically like, hey, my guys are going to fight your guys, and whoever of us has the most money is probably going to win that conflict. It's not necessarily going to be whoever's in accordance with the NAP or whatever. If I have a conflict with Coca-Cola, they're going to kick my ass. I don't have the money to defend myself against a large corporation.
Well, I think the two arguments there. So I for one, and this is one of the things that they'll like to rag on me on is I'm no longer so much opposed to using the state to. Given that we're not, going to have Ancapistan, tomorrow or probably in our lifetimes, if ever, I think it's acceptable to use the state to impose laws, rules, whatever, that would reflect what Ancapistan would look like. So, for example, enforcing borders. In Ancapistan, of course, there are going to be borders, and they're going to be enforced. There's, you still have things like trespass, et cetera, et cetera. And so, thus, it's not really inappropriate to have a state enforce borders because you would still be doing that in Ancapistan anyway. So the other that's a good segue to the other point being that it's not necessarily about not having governing bodies or anything like or agencies using force, but rather to decentralize or more importantly not have a singular monopoly on force.
That's basically what I was getting at.
So Ancapistan would look very much like, say, a minarchist constitutional republic, but there wouldn't be a singular monopoly running the whole thing.
Yeah, and that's where well, first I'll just comment on the monopoly and then I'll comment on the state. But with monopoly, when you're talking about agencies of force, there has to be some consistency in the application of force. If it's Matt's agency versus my agency, they're going to war with each other. If it's the Democrats' agency versus the Republicans' agencies, they're going to war with each other. So you end up you need that monopoly, or you have faction wars. You have conflicts. So it ends up being, this governing body that, basically makes everybody fall in line.
Well, I think you can have consensus without monopoly.
Well, yeah,
consensus is imperative, and so and here's one where I find it a little tricky myself. You need to have a whole group of people that do in fact have a consensus and agree upon these things before any of this is possible. And I think a fairly valid criticism is like, well, isn't that just sort of like the communist new man? You
Yeah.
know, like you can't have communism until you have a new kind of person.
Once we're all ANCAPs.
Yeah, so I
Or
and
most of us.
Can I
yeah, and so
interject?
I think that's a valid point. Is you already have to be an ANCAP for ANCAPistan to function. At which point, what's even the point of having calling it ANCAPistan? It's just it's the new man, which is how do you achieve that? Well, that's the problem. Just like it is in communism.
From a practical standpoint, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, there's no point of sitting around having mental masturbation unless this is something we can actually.
Well, that's why I never have this conversation because I just don't see a point in it. But it is interesting to have.
Yeah, no,
But,
it is interesting to have, and I think.
But
I think
let me
you do have
just
some good
interject
points.
one thing in regards to having a monopoly on, like what you said, consistency. I mean, you don't there's no. The relationship between major world powers is essentially anarchic. I mean, you don't have. I mean, you could say the UN, but they're not really making the rules. That's just like a joint consensus between these nations that say it's in our best interest if we're not constantly at war with each other. Never mind the Middle East, but if we're not constantly at war with each other, it works out better for everybody. So we'll set up these consensus rules that we'll all be sort of obligated to follow, and it tends to result in a better outcome.
Yeah, and so then if you have that consensus, it's not just you against Coca-Cola; it's everybody against Coca-Cola.
Right.
Yeah. Well, with the thing with the nations, we have political boundaries separating them. So, like, if you imagine America and every other country disappeared, we still have that monopoly within those boundaries. There's no overlap. So it's when you have America trying to impose their laws in Canada and the Canadian government is like, whoa, this is our turf, then you have conflicts, then you have wars.
Sure.
So if you stay within your boundaries, you can maintain multiple monopolies around the world. It's just carved up into countries. So that's how that works. And then,
I think all we're sort of arguing for is to take that monopoly just all the way down to the individual.
Well, it's just not going to work because you got so many individuals that they're not ANCAPs. They're violent. They're crazy. They're psychopaths. Like, they definitely need to be governed. Like the self-governing thing. And one of my favorite things, I'll always be like another self-governing individual, like a rapist or some crazy person that, did something terrible. And I'm like, it's obviously these people their behavior needs to be governed by someone else because they can't behave themselves. So maybe in a world of angels, that's where we use the angels quote, like, this will work in a world of angels, but as soon as people are misbehave, you have to crack down on them with force.
Yeah, I mean, no one's saying that you have the right to defend your property. And people can join together as a collective to defend their collective property and contract with.
Well, that's what we've done with the state.
organizations.
That's what we've done. It's a collective
the
organization. It's a social organization that
But it's
collectively imposes the community's will. And unfortunately, we're in the minority as libertarians. And I consider myself a classical liberal, but their welfare warfare state gets imposed on us against our will. But that's partially because we're the minority in America. We're a very small political faction that's just being dominated. But I wanted to say one thing about the state. You guys, ANCAPs in general, are enemies of the state. They hate the state. You got to watch out for hatred. Like, you shouldn't be forming your political beliefs based on an emotion like hatred. You definitely want to, think clearly and not be blinded by hate, and which is easy because the state does do a lot of bad things. And it's like, I hate these guys, but you don't want to do that. And then my philosophy, the state is the foundation of society. It's actually the most important institution in society. Our entire market economy revolves around, the rules that makes. And you guys hate the state. So we have,
Kyle,
even though
question. If the state had a penis, would you blow it?
No, I don't. I don't worship the state. A lot of people are like, "Oh, you love it" or whatever. I don't love it. Like, it's a utilitarian. It's a practical consideration. It's like, we need this just because this is how capitalism has to function. It needs this forceful backstop in case people break the rules of the market. If they step out of bounds, then there has to be a crackdown. It's just like referees in sports,
So it sounds like basically as an ideal, you don't have a problem with anarcho-capitalism, but the problem is that in order to actually enact that in the real world, you're going to necessarily have to end up with something that fundamentally is a de facto state of some sort. Is that at least approximately?
I think it's a bad idea to let people, private interests, employ violence at their own discretion. Like I said, corporations, individuals, people have all different ideas of how they would use violence. They would pay for violence differently. They might hire assassins. They might hire mercenaries. I think it would be a huge disaster.
But I mean, that's still true even with, our current state or any other state. I mean,
it's a lot less just because it's illegal. We have rules, and people say, oh, well, murder still happens, so the state's not doing anything. If you really lived in a lawless, stateless area, it's much, much worse than what we're accustomed to. People fight. We fight over resources. We fight over everything.
Lawless and stateless aren't necessarily one and the same.
Well, who makes the laws?
I mean, we kind of already went over that.
I mean, somebody needs to have that political authority to say what you can and can't do. So you need to have power over people in order to make laws. It can't just be, hey, the NAP is now in effect. Like, no one cares that Walter Block thinks the NAP is in effect. Like, what matters is what laws got passed and what laws police enforce, and that's what actually happens in the real world.
Well, I mean, there are things like, say, an HOA, like homeowners association. Mm-hmm. They have rules and people subscribe to them, voluntarily. So, I mean, an HOA is not incompatible with, ANCAPistan at all.
They're backed by they're not totally voluntary because they can legally, put a lien on your house or whatever. I have an HOA, so a little bit of my political philosophy I learned through my HOA, which is funny. But if you ultimately have a problem with your HOA, it does fall back to the state. It goes to real court. It goes to real government. So anytime there's a conflict, if you pull on the thread far enough, you wind up at that real court, at the government with the teeth that can actually say, this is how it's going to be. So it's a backstop. It's like baseball, that's the forceful stop on conflict.
Okay. And so I guess, I think I understand what you're saying, but it's basically that you have to have that backstop, and even if you want to call it something else in ANCAPistan, it still fundamentally is a state.
If you're going to say it's going to be my way or the highway, you have to have the power to actually back that up. How much force do you really have? As an individual, you're very, very weak. Self-defense, you have to think, what happens if I get attacked by 15, by 20, by 300, by 3 million people, an army? People organize. They organize into these huge groups, and you got to be able to match that force, and that's where you end up with a monopoly.
I think that's all fair.
You don't have an argument against that?
No,
you only have arguments for Trump now.
Well, no, I mean, it all makes sense. I mean, I guess I don't want to get hung up on some autistic argument about oh no, but that's not a state. You would have a private defense force and blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, what's the difference between some sort of unilateral agreement between private defense forces, blah blah? It's like, well, okay, now you're just giving a different name to a state, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, why wouldn't there be private offense forces? I mean, certainly there'd be demand for, oh, this guy screwed me in business, so I want to, hurt him or get him back. There's definitely demand for aggressive violence.
And it does exist, and that does happen in the real world.
It's illegal.
To an extent.
But,
sure.
Communally, we don't tolerate that.
Sure.
That doesn't mean people can't sneak it in and get away with it. Again, I love sports analogies. It's not just because we have rules doesn't mean people can't commit fouls, but that doesn't mean we should get rid of the referees and hopefully the players all sort it out themselves.
Well, I think it's more of a... And, you can get into the nitty-gritty and we can argue over theoretical possibilities, but... that's why I don't really like to have these arguments per se, because I think we all, and I've had this sort of argument with the taxation is theft debate, which is basically, I just want people to admit that it is theft, but perhaps it's a necessary evil. Let's
when you say evil, you're saying that's a value judgment. That's an opinion. To say something's evil, good or evil, it's like, okay.
Stealing's wrong. Who doesn't believe that stealing's wrong?
Surprisingly, a lot of people support taxation.
I think you're confusing
so a lot of people don't think it's wrong.
I think you're confusing nihilism with anarchism. It's not saying there's no values. In fact, the thing about I guess voluntarists and cat people are that they believe in objective morality, right? Whereas you can have the postmodernists and like the New Left or whatever that are just completely subjectivists in that regard. So it's not like we're saying that there is no absolute wrong or right. We're just saying that the method of sort of enforcing that should be different than having a state monopoly on violence that you are, essentially forced into. Now, I mean, we don't need to go back down the road of like, what does that look like in Ancapistan? Does it actually look like a state, but just like decentralized and like many little states or whatever? But going back to the taxation of theft thing, my goal is to just get people to see like what's going on with taxation. And I mean, you've already said that you see it as dues, so you probably won't take my argument.
And I could say, well, you drive on public roads, right? And that's something that communally we all chip in for, everybody pays for, and so it's like you're going to drive on public roads, but then you don't want to pay for them.
Yeah, but I don't have the option.
I know, but you wouldn't have the option if it was private roads either. If you wanted to get anywhere, you would have to pay whatever that person wanted for passage on their land.
You don't have to pay in a parking or to park in a parking lot or to drive around a parking lot. Those are totally privately owned.
Yeah, they do let you, but the point is, like, if there was one access point to your house,
yeah, but the thing is,
where else are you going to go? How else are you going to move around if the private owner doesn't allow you access? You're stuck.
That argument could go on forever. I mean, there could be multiple roads. There could be, who knows? Maybe we'd be flying around in jetpacks
or helicopters, from which you could chuck communists out of. So killing two birds with one stone.
The quotient of voluntarism that's involved in that scenario, I think, is greater than the one that's implied living under a state, as we have the state today. I mean, you don't have that choice. You have to pay for. I mean, yes, there's a few private roads around, but major highways are not privatized. Interstate highways are not privatized.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's. I don't like that argument of, well, you drive on the road, so therefore
you have to pay for them.
You have to pay for them.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's sort of what it is. But I know people don't like taxes. And
I mean, I wouldn't mind paying for them if they were privately owned, and I could choose which ones I wanted to use based on quality of service or whether it's a more direct route.
Yeah.
But, you can't just steal from me and then buy me something and say, oh, but it's just because I bought you something and you use it. Like if you come and you just take my TV and you take my money and then you buy me a new TV and I use that TV. I mean, that
it's a little different situation though, because the road isn't in your house. It's not on your property. It's not your land. It's not your property. So like any way you slice it, you're gonna have to pay for it. You're basically going to be forced to pay for it. Whatever that road owner wants, you're going to need access. If you have to pass and there's no other way around, then you're going to have to pass. And that's Mises is my favorite philosopher. He talks about limited space monopoly, where there's not always enough room to build a second road in one spot. Like there might only be enough actual physical space for one road, and that owner gets a monopoly on that passageway in that area. But that's kind of a whole nother subject. I get it that you guys don't like taxes. I think my position is we want taxes to be as low as possible. They would be minimal under a minarchist state, but I think that that's the price that we have to pay for law and order and for social cohesion. So it's a utilitarian argument.
But that is what I'm saying, though.
I know. I know you think it's immoral, but like I don't think it's immoral. So we just have a disagreement on the morals of it. So how else can we compare other than to say, do we need this? Do we not need this? Like, how is this actually going to work?
And I think it's probably also worth pointing out. I mean, you do describe yourself as a minarchist, and so I don't know exactly what level of government you advocate for, but I mean, inherent in minarchism, that means as little as possible. So I mean, I think you do agree with us that making it as as the taxes as low as possible, government control as little as possible, is the ideal. It's just that going all the way to full ANCAP is just not realistic or practical.
Why should government be as little as possible? Is it just a purely pragmatic stance, or do you find an ethical problem with government?
No, it's not an ethical thing. It's the fact that the private sector is more efficient and does allocate resources better. Government, anything it does, it's going to produce losses. It's not a business. It's not for sale. The law shouldn't be for sale. Police shouldn't be for sale. It's a completely different kind of entity from a business. It's not a consumer thing. It's a political entity. So, and I think the real rationale is it can't. I don't know. I'm trying to think of the right way to explain this. I'm thinking back to my Mises book, Bureaucracy, where he explains the reason for bureaucratic management instead of for-profit management. There are two different ways of calculating or organizing. Bureaucracy, you guys know, is based on law, command, budgetary maintenance. It's like we get X amount of money and we spend it. This is how we allocate those resources. For profit, you're selling those services in the marketplace. So bureaucratic management is used for things that basically can't, I think he said can't be checked by economic calculation. Can't be bought and sold. I don't know how you put a price on, like, maybe justice. Somebody murders my mother or something. Like, I don't know what price there is on that. And I think maybe that was the reason why. But he's like, what is the price on an army protecting your country from being annihilated? What is the market value of that? It's not a market thing. It's a political thing. So you'd have to read Bureaucracy. I explained it as best I could remember. But
so you really are truly just a police, courts, military kind of minarchist.
I'm on the fence about roads. I like the idea. I'm also engaging politically. So it's like, that's a big kind of step. You have to really be able to work out the logistics of it. You can't just say ma roads and win that argument. You have to explain who exactly is going to own them, how the transition is going to happen from public to private, how it's going to work where you have I have a road running through my community, right? And it's like, who's going to own that road so that I need to pass on to get out of my house and to go to other places, and all of my neighbors share it. It really is a shared road.
Well, so I guess the HOA could own it, but
yeah, the HOA
but at that
could,
point we are sort of getting back into
then you're imposing dues on all those community members that everybody has to pay, and you're basically taxing everybody a little bit to pay for the maintenance of that road because it's a collectively owned resource. So sometimes they say classical liberalism includes roads and minarchism does not. Mises unfortunately didn't give hardly any guidance on roads, so I usually include roads. So I say public safety, which is police, courts, military, prisons, and then the maintenance of public property, which is basically roads and anything we want to keep public, which you can keep some areas reserved and undeveloped and just keep them public. Like, it's not some great offense against humanity if we have a park somewhere or something like that. It's okay. So
if nothing else, it's not a good hill to die on as an ANCAP.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I want to go. I went to Rothbard, then I went to Mises, and Mises was pretty much in alignment with Ron Paul when he was campaigning. Constitutional, limited government, and it wasn't anything that really was that crazy or that shocking to people. Like, maybe we shouldn't be intervening in all these countries. That's a great thing. Like, people need to hear that message, and they don't need to hear abolish the military on top of that. Just let's bring the troops home, let's start minding our own business around the world, let's stop picking fights. That's great. So
so what is the minarchist or classical liberal position on stealthing?
Stealthing. First of all, we should explain what stealthing is, and I've been talking for a while. If one of you guys wants
we're like 39 minutes in, and stealthing's our first topic, dude.
Yeah. I can riff on political theory.
So, as far as I understand, stealthing is taking having sex with a girl, wearing a condom, and then stealthily removing the condom mid coitus.
Dude, so are you saying bros can't stealth bros?
Well, so the one thing I want to clarify, and I know you've been having debates and discussions about this, is I think somebody when we brought this topic up earlier was saying that it was for the purpose of blowing your load inside a girl. Now, I would think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the issue is, like, even if I wanted to have sex without a condom, I still don't want to blow my load inside a girl, because I just want to have sex without a condom. It's not about unloading the girl. So is stealthing explicitly to blow your load inside a woman, or is it just
no, I think
removing
it's just
the
removing
condom?
the condom.
I'm not the expert on stealthing. The article that I read, the guy was like, it just feels better. So I don't think his intention was to impregnate and run. Or, I mean, the condom is as much for you as it is for her because neither of you is trying for a pregnancy at that point. So I don't know why you would remove the birth control and jeopardize child support payments and all of that.
Dude.
Yeah.
I can tell you why. Because this state that Kyle Wagner advocates will pay for that child anyways, dude.
So it's a technique to get welfare, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know.
No. I mean, I'm pretty sure the stealthing technique is just because dudes don't want to wear condoms.
So
I know dudes that don't wear condoms, and I think they're fucking retarded. Well, I mean, dudes that are unmarried and not trying to have kids.
Yeah,
that don't wear
well,
condoms.
I mean, you know, you can if
birth control.
If you're with, I mean, you know, if so, there's two reasons to wear a condom. One is for, you know, pregnancy, and the other is, of course, for STDs.
Yeah.
You know, so I've definitely been with long-term girlfriends that are on their own, you know, birth control, whether it's hormone or whatever. So
right,
if you have that
exception,
in, you know, that or possibly that in combination with pulling out or something, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, there are times where, you know, it can make sense. You're not trying to have a kid, and you still also just don't want to wear a condom. And as far as I understand, you know, it feels better for women too. At least that's what I've been told. I don't know. But certainly it feels better for guys. There's no doubt about that.
But I think this whole stealthing thing is based on that. It isn't the idea of like this dude just wants to knock up this girl, so he's gonna rip off the condom.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that plays into some of it, but I think the actual definition is just the act of removing the condom.
Yeah, sure.
So that being said, I guess we can have a little round table on what we think about this.
I mean that seems like a clearly immoral, fraudulent, aggressive, bad thing. You know, if the girl is only consented on the condition that you're wearing a condom, and then you take the condom off, well, that's not part of, you know, that's violating a condition of the consent. And thus, you know, could you call it rape? I don't know if I'd go that far, but I don't object to that right off the bat either. It's certainly, I have no problem with considering that a sexual assault of some sort.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're at least familiar with some arguments against that, whether they're your own or others.
They're not mine. This is a very delicate subject. Like, I don't want people to just say, oh, he's promoting rape or something if I try to play devil's advocate and take the other side of it. But it's been very heated with libertarians. Their kind of position is it's not an assault. You know, you're having sex. It's not rape. It was consensual sex, and then they bring up like all the different scenarios with women on the other side of lying about birth control. Is that rape? Is that the same kind of crime? So I saw a lot of arguments where people were saying, hey, this should not be a crime. I do want to say, when you frame the topic, when we talk about this kind of stuff, I talk about it.
Well, like right there, I think when you said if a woman lied about being on birth control, I mean, that's essentially the same sort of crime. And
that's what they're saying.
Hold on, like it's a thing that's happened. Everybody's heard of it.
Yeah. So is that a punishable crime?
I've never heard.
I think it should be a civil.
It should be.
I think it should be something that you can take someone to court for. I don't know that it should be a criminal thing, but you know, if you agree to a contract and you break that contract, it should go to, what do they call it, claims court.
You could say that's defrauding.
I mean,
you could say you were defrauded.
What I'm saying. I would exactly say it's defrauding.
Isn't that basically stealthing? Isn't like a female version of stealthing to
what?
Like, to lie about birth control?
I think it would.
Yeah. I think if there were any sort of agreements like that, explicit agreements beforehand, and they were violated, I mean, I think you should be able to take that to court. I don't know that it should be a criminal. I don't think it should be a criminal thing per se, though. I mean, if you've agreed to be penetrated or whatever.
Well, that's just really penalties, right? Aren't we just talking about how harsh the penalties should be? What's civil? Is that a fine or something, or community service?
Well, I mean, in a civil case, you could sue them.
You can. Yeah, I'm talking about suing. Yeah,
just for money.
Yeah,
instead of
like criminal implies that they could go to jail.
Okay.
Which I don't think they should go to jail for that.
I mean, maybe they should.
I'm going to tell you right now, this is a very touchy subject with a lot of people. I'm just warning you.
Well, not with us.
I know with you guys, but I'm like, I do not want people like. Actually, what do I care? I already got T-shirts being made up from people that hate me so much.
What are they going to make hoodies with you?
I'm not saying it isn't wrong. Obviously, I'm saying it's super wrong, and it's it violates the non-aggression principle.
I think we have to clarify. We think this practice is wrong. Yeah. Do not do this.
I mean, I think this is what we were talking about before, an act of aggression. So
It's definitely messed up. It's really messed up.
Yeah, but
and I know.
I just don't know that it deserves that the punishment, and I guess it is an issue of the severity of the punishment in relationship to the crime.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I would say the guy should be thrown in jail for it. And if you're going to throw him in jail, then you got to throw the chick in jail that takes out the birth control or lies about being on birth control.
What I wanted to say was when we frame this, and you're framing it the right way, is like you have to think like a lawmaker. If we're going to make this rule, and this is going to be the rule for our society, this is going to be the law, and then if people break this, then they get punished in accordance with the rules that are on the books. And like the founding fathers never had to think about this or discuss or debate this because they didn't even, I don't think, had condoms back then, right? Like this wasn't even a thing. So the law kind of changes.
Rudimentary, like they'd use like sheep intestines and stuff.
Yeah, they had like weird ass condoms.
Do you think like Jefferson ever like debated stealthing? You think?
Maybe
they sat around and were like, all right, what about this?
You think he was stealthing all the slaves?
I think he raw dogged them. I'm sorry, man.
Yeah, that was far worse than just stealthing.
Yeah. Oh, right. Yeah, having sex with someone who's your legal property. That's probably a whole nother level of debating consent.
Yeah, that's.
Do you even consent to be owned by me in the first place?
Violations there.
Oh God.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I can maybe see some debate over whether it's criminal or not. I mean, obviously, when you're talking about lying about birth control, then a man can end up being on the hook for the next 18 years of his life for child support or God knows what else. For which there are, criminal penalties for which they can go to jail for not paying and whatever. Mm-hmm. So, that's really bad. And so I think this argument that, women can lie about birth control. Well, yeah, they can, but they shouldn't. It's still wrong. And maybe there should be a law, whether that law just allows for civil penalties or it is a real criminal law. I haven't thought that far ahead about it. But on the other side, I mean, with the stealthing thing, I mean, there is, as we said before, half the reason for condoms is to prevent against STDs. Mm-hmm. So if somebody does in fact transmit an STD by stealthing a girl, that's a very clear, tangible, physically aggressive violation of their body. Well, so I mean, that's potentially even worse than rape in a sense. I mean, if you're knowingly, forcibly giving diseases to a person,
then you get into how do you prove this? Because it ultimately, similar to rape, it's a he said, she said kind of thing. It's even harder to prove than rape because there you might have skin under the fingernails. She might have bruising, signs of resistance. This is pretty much just like he just goes, it slipped off. So trying to prove in court that a guy intentionally takes off a condom, unless he openly admits it, is very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and I think that probably is the biggest stickler there is, and this is a big problem with all sorts of sexual assault crimes is, like you said, there's the he said, she said element of it. How do you prove it? How do you prevent people from abusing?
Right.
Well,
people make false rape accusations all the time.
Yep. Let me throw another example at you, though. What about a chick or a guy that lies about having herpes?
Yeah, that's a good one.
There are laws on the books, as far as I understand, there are laws on the books against regarding knowingly
transmitting an STD
to a person.
Because you do that point you make about STDs regarding the stealthing, that is a valid point. So,
and even that may be hard to prove. I mean, how do you prove that they knew that they had this disease beforehand? Well, there are ways to prove it. But
if they got tested and it was recorded somewhere.
Well, yeah, exactly. But that's not always going to be the case. Maybe they really had no idea. Yeah. There is no evidence that exists anywhere because they really didn't know. So, again, like how do you actually...
what if you have it, you do the stealthy, and then you give her STDs, and it's a double whammy, dude.
There's two charges. That's two different charges, right? Stealthing charge and STD charge.
Man.
Intentional STD
You're
charge.
You're either going away for a long time or you're paying a lot of money.
Yeah, there probably is it is tricky. How do you actually enforce a law like that?
Yeah.
And maybe that's a good argument for it needing to be a civil thing.
Yeah.
Where there are no criminal penalties.
I could sign on to that if the four of us were lawmakers and we were voting on this law right now. I think you guys have persuaded me, at least for civil.
For civil?
I think so. I think it's pretty messed up. The proof is hard, but I don't know what we would do about that. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a law or that it shouldn't be illegal.
Just to be devil's advocate with that, even with a civil case, there's a far lower requirement, burden of proof. It's a preponderance of evidence. It's basically 51% instead of 99.9.
Okay.
Isn't it?
So
and it's
maybe
basically
that
just a
could be
judge
problematic
deciding
too.
That,
Yeah, well,
you know.
it's basically, is it more likely than not, you know, that this premise or whatever is true.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly wrong, morally, ethically, whatever. How do you craft a law or enforce a law around that? That gets really tricky. That said, all of that stuff, it does apply to as well to things like, you know, just rape in and of itself, and that those laws are abused all the time with false rape accusations and a whole other multitude of things. But that doesn't mean necessarily we're better off without having rape laws. You know, maybe we need to have reform regarding how the laws are worded, how they're enforced, how they're judged. So it's a tricky thing. But I guess, so it doesn't sound like anybody's really advocating. Well, I guess, no, you did bring up some arguments that people had made that, like, oh, well, it's not really that bad. They already consented, blah, blah, blah.
And they
like,
blame the
bogus.
woman. A lot of guys are like, hey, make better choices with the guys that you sleep with. Make sure you know them better. Fewer one-night stands. So I've gotten a lot of that.
Blaming.
I've seen a lot of that.
They're not wrong, though.
Yeah,
Well,
and that
okay,
comes
they're
from
not
the
wrong. They're
that
not
also
wrong
comes
that you're
from
responsible for your sexual partners, but they're also not right that, therefore, their sexual partners are free to do whatever the fuck they want to do.
Yeah, no, that's
like,
of
okay,
course.
you shouldn't be, you know, walking around the park at night in a bathing suit. Stop, man. Walking around in a park in a bathing suit, but, you know, that doesn't mean that you should be raped. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, yes, it's not a smart thing, and like part of, I don't want to say the blame, but part of like the causes that led to that action may have been being in an unsafe location at a certain hour, wearing provocative clothing, but that doesn't make the rape right.
Yeah, it doesn't make it okay. But you know, I mean, for anybody that, you know, wants to defraud you, I mean, you know, I don't think it's inappropriate to point out where victims have been negligent. Not, you know, and it doesn't have to be solely to criticize them, and certainly not to say that, oh, well, thus you deserved it.
Right.
But just out of interest to help that victim and other potential victims in the future. It's like, you still need to be vigilant. You shouldn't be engaging in this negligent behavior that puts you in a position where you might have this problem. I think that's just one thing, just society-wide. You know, people always say, oh, but you're victim blaming, you're victim shaming, this and that. It's like, no, I'm trying to help the victim, and I'm trying to prevent future victims.
Like when you suggest that women ought to, you know, take self-defense courses or be trained to use a weapon, and people are like, well, they shouldn't live in a society where they have to. And it's like, yeah, I mean, we shouldn't, but we do.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
like,
exactly.
until we can figure that shit out, like, go get fucking, you know, jujitsu lessons.
Just a real simple story that just happened to a Facebook friend of mine. Her bike was stolen out of her front yard with like $700 tires on it. And the first commenter was like, well, did you lock it up at night? You know, and I guess she had just laid it down in the yard. And he was like, well, there you go. And then, of course, it started a whole thing. They're like, you're victim blaming or whatever. But it's a simple example of, okay, yes, it was wrong. Yes, it was a theft. Yes, the blame is on the thief. But, you know, it's good to take some simple precautions like locking your doors and locking up your bike and just not sleeping around or whatever so that you don't get in those situations either. Sure. I'm not trying to blame a victim, but it's just good advice.
Yeah. Well, and I bring this argument up. Well, I don't bother bringing it up anymore, but I believe this argument applies in almost all of these, you know, quote unquote police brutality cases. And this goes for a whole lot of stuff that I see on Cop Block and other pages. Certainly just about everything that comes out of the BLM movement, which is that, you know, they complain about the way the cops are treating them, but you know, these are people that are clearly like the Alton Sterling shooting. I think that was the guy where they were wrestling with the guy on the ground and ended up shooting him while they were like had him pinned to the ground or whatever. Well, the guy was reaching for a gun, and they did in fact find a gun in the pocket that he was, you know, reaching for and struggling for the whole time. And they say, oh, well, he didn't have a gun in his hand, blah, blah, blah. Well, the motherfucker is fighting cops. What do you think is going to happen? It doesn't matter whether the cops are justified or not. It doesn't matter whether the law is correct or not. The fact is, you're fighting people whose job it is to subdue you by any level of force necessary. And so to sit there and say, oh, but I'm a sovereign citizen, you can't do blah, blah. It's like, well, I don't care what is right and wrong here. It's just the actual physics of this altercation are that their job and their duty and what they are going to do is fuck your shit up until you comply. And so I find it really ridiculous for people to complain about like, oh my God, you see that he didn't feel like he had to get out of the car, and then this cop smashed his window in and yanked him out forcefully. It's like, well, yeah, no shit. What the fuck did you think was gonna happen? Yeah, it doesn't mean that the cop is right, but it still means that you're a complete fucking idiot for thinking that it was gonna go down any other way.
Well, okay. Well, what about the dude who was shot in the back by the cop? And
as he was running away, there are, and this is why it pisses me off, because there are absolutely instances where I do think the cops really should be taken to, not taken to task, but there are some there are some very questionable cases, and that certainly is one of them, where the guy was in fact running away. There was no reason to believe that he was armed, whatever. So there are very questionable cases, and then they get totally overshadowed by all these ridiculous nonsense cases like the Alton Sterling one, where it's like the dude was fucking fighting them trying to reach for a gun. What did you think was gonna happen?
Well, I mean, dude, like I actually on that one, like I watched the video like a million times. Like I kept watching it back and forth. And
the guy that ran away. No, he got shot in the back?
Alton Sterling.
Okay, and that's the guy who was like selling CDs in front of a 7-Eleven, and he was fighting down the ground.
Well,
okay.
Here's what disturbed me about that, because like the fucking headlines were like, cops shoot man for selling CDs, and then I was pissed when I saw that headline, and then when I read into the story, it was the cops went there because somebody said that this dude had a gun, and he was in that parking lot, and he threatened to shoot them with it. Mm-hmm. So like he was threatening violence on somebody. That was the police report.
If we believe the story, although he did in fact have a gun, so they probably knew what they were talking about.
He did. But the thing is, like, I've seen the video. The video was taken from like 2 different angles. And neither angle can you prove the cop's guilt. So, I mean, they're innocent. Because, innocent until proven guilty, correct?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you say prove guilt. I mean, guilt of what? That's what I don't even understand.
I mean, well, it would be guilt of murder. But, in the video, I think they even say, like, he's got a gun. Like, he's grabbing for his gun.
Yeah, multiple times.
Yeah. But, I mean, it's like you really can't see what's happening in the video. So, at least it's enough to say that they're, innocent because they're not proven guilty by the video.
Yeah, well, I mean, in fact, I think they're proven innocent because as soon as, like, after the altercation is over, they pull the gun out of his pocket, the one that you can see. I mean, they're pinning him down and his arm isn't really moving much, but they sure look like they're struggling pretty hard to get his hand away from his pocket, before they end up actually shooting him. So, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they're proven innocent in that video.
I think in a lot of cases they are. Yeah, I think in a lot of cases where they say this is an example of police abuse, and I'm like, it wasn't really. I mean, I can understand what the officers were thinking in that situation. So it's a case by case kind of thing. But they do use a lot of examples, and they'll include every police shooting in their statistic. And it's like, well, okay, I've seen ones where the guy was literally pulling a gun out of his waistband and bringing it up to shoot the officer, and he gets shot, and then they're like, brutality.
well,
yeah. It's absolutely madness. And it's the same thing as false rape accusations. They've discussed me. One of the things I find most disgusting about them is that they belittle legitimate, cases of rape, or in this case, legitimate cases of police brutality or police misconduct, and they bring up all this nonsense bullshit that just makes
Doesn't it also seem like the media just likes to pick those ones up too, like the ones that are not.
Yeah,
it seems they like to pick the ones that are
that are bogus,
that are either bogus or it's like bullshit, so on the line, and there's like not enough evidence to really prove one way or the other. Like the whole, the Michael Brown thing. Yeah, there was all sorts of conflicting reports and like surveillance that wasn't really related to the crime that sort of was related, and then it's like, but then you have something where
right around that,
like the dude getting shot in the back that you were talking about.
Yeah,
it's like this is clearly like police brutality.
Yeah, and they always focus on the ones that are questionable at best, or demonstrably the cops did nothing wrong. And meanwhile, there are other things like the I think it was Baby Boo was what the name was of a kid that was in like the living room of some house that was getting raided. He was in like a crib or like a little playpen thing or something. A baby.
Yeah.
They toss a flashbang in, and like the kid survived, but like he's gonna be like scarred and maimed for life. Like like phosphorus burns on his face and shit.
Right. And
I never heard BLM talk about that even once. There was another case where it was a drug raid where it was like a 7 or 8 year old girl was in her bed and got shot in the head during a drug raid gone wrong. Those are things worth talking about and looking at. These are clearly, whether the cops are right or wrong, these are very tragic cases where there's a lot of gray that, can and probably should be discussed. But instead they focus on things like Michael Brown, where like the only evidence we have is of him being a thug and a criminal, and a bunch of conflicting stories that were later proved to be like complete bullshit and whatever.
Right, they still use him. They still use him as an example.
And they use all these examples. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, they're just deliberately trying to be divisive. They're trying to rile up black people to get all pissed off over cases that white people are going to look at and be like, what are you talking about? This is bullshit. I think they're being very deliberately divisive because there are plenty of examples where white people would be on board with a 7-year-old girl getting shot in the head in her bed, or a baby getting a fucking flashbang in his crib. Everybody would get on board with that, but they never talk about those cases.
They pick the wrong cases.
Yeah, and they do it consistently enough and egregiously enough that I have to.
It's got to be on purpose. I mean,
it has to be,
because you can't. If you can't. How many stories can you write if it's just clear cut police brutality? I mean, yeah, you can take on the police brutality angle and just keep talking about that, but you can't milk that individual story for all it's worth. If it's clear cut. Whereas if you have these conflicting reports and surveillance videos that come in and witness testimony that changes every day, like that's a story that you can blast for. I mean, hell, they're still blasting it, like you said. So I mean, it's got to be to some degree on purpose.
Yeah,
I would think.
And so when I see people like Cop Block and all these organizations that are just explicitly anti-cop, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I'm an ANCAP. I have my problems with, the state and cops and this and that, but to pick out all of these examples that are clearly not, clear-cut examples of police abuse, and you're focusing on that stuff, and all you're doing is belittling legitimate arguments and complaints against, police, abuse and violence or whatever. It just frustrates the hell out of me. It's just the same as false rape accusations. If I was an actual rape victim, I would be infuriated by stupid cunts like Mattress Girl and all these other people that just make shit up for attention.
And those are the ones that get the attention.
Yeah,
I'm not anti-cop. I'm obviously police are included in minarchism, and I just try to call a fair game. Like if I think it was justified, if I think they were okay, then I'll side with them. And if I think that they were abusive or it was brutality, then I side with the victim. So I just call it on a case-by-case basis and try to be objective about it. I'm not just like, I hate cops. You got a badge, therefore you're automatically an asshole.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to judge the behavior of cops independent of judging the law. I mean, there's plenty of laws that in fact, almost all the laws I disagree with, but I don't think it's appropriate to hold the specific cops accountable for enforcing those laws. I mean, it's not really reasonable at all, I think, to expect cops to then suddenly become their own, independent legislators that are deciding what laws are correct and wrong.
Okay. Well, Ethan.
Not that there's no room for any level of discretion.
Ethan, say you're a mechanic, right?
Like a car mechanic.
Yeah,
okay.
Like one of those dudes. Okay. And you're like fucking, you're fixing people's cars and shit. And say your boss is like, oh, I want you to start telling people that more shit is wrong, so we can sell them expensive parts and labor. Should that be frowned upon? Is that a douchebag thing to do?
It's unethical.
They're just doing their job, though, dude.
Yeah, but they don't see the laws. Job, they don't see the laws as unethical. Like the war on drugs,
because they don't have an ethical framework. That's the problem.
Yeah, dude,
it's just to them the war on drugs is not unethical.
Isn't that even worse for cops who are like murdering people?
I mean, that's the problem with law.
And that's the problem with the state. Drugs, dude.
The problem with the law in the state, at least as you seem to have defined it, in an ideal sense, is that the law, like whatever the laws are passed, they're essentially arbitrary,
Yeah.
And the only reason that they matter is because they're enforced, right? And the only reason they're ethical in the sense of the law is because they're enforced. And see, that's the problem, is then you have stuff like the war on drugs, which we know is not ethical because...
That's a value judgment. You got to watch out for that.
Yeah, I'm okay with making value judgments.
A lot of people don't agree. A lot of people will say,
that's fine.
You know, drugs destroy families, drugs do this, drugs do that. They're horrible. They should be illegal. So you just get into basically arguing, these are my morals, those are your morals. Like, you know,
yeah, but that's what philosophy is. I mean,
yeah, but you know, you got to be able to convince people, and that's why I make utilitarian arguments. I'll list 10 reasons why drugs should be legal. You know, I'll say, look at all the crime that it's creating, with the black market.
But why is crime bad?
It's just harmful to society. It's just destructive. You know, it
why?
Kills people, hurts people.
But why is it bad to hurt people?
Yeah, I guess when I say bad, I'm making a value judgment. You are, aren't I? Yeah,
exactly.
So you're always starting with some framework of what you envision as the goal.
That's what I'm saying.
You know?
Yeah,
everybody's a judger.
Yeah, everybody is a judger. So
that's why when people say, and I'm not accusing you of this, but people will say, "Well, I'm not an idealist. I'm not an idealist." Well, I mean, obviously it depends on how you define the term, but ultimately you're operating from some sort of
ideal,
even some sort of ideal, some sort of framework. It might be kind of loose. It might not be like the non-aggression principle, which you know I think is clearly laid out. But you know, it might just be a utilitarian or a consequentialist, or maybe you're actually evil and you just want to inflict as much pain as possible. But I mean, either way, you're operating from some sort of ideal.
Yeah,
just throwing that out there.
And people's ideals aren't always the same. You know,
right.
Some people they might value equality in society. They want everybody to have the same level of wealth. They don't want anybody to be higher, to have nicer clothes, to drive nicer cars. You know, they're egalitarians, and they're totally willing to use force to achieve that end. And that means taking from A and giving to B to redistribute wealth or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, and to them that's fine because that's in line with their ideal.
Right.
So this is why we need to chuck some people out of helicopters. It all comes full circle.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny he says that. Like, I've noticed a trend of people as they encounter the far left, Antifa, and communists and socialists on Facebook and stuff. They've gotten very hard, and that's what happens with fascism and nationalism and stuff. Like, people get hard, and they're like, "This is unacceptable. I'm tired of this crazy shit," and they turn hard, and it's like. I've seen it it's usually the Hoppian kind of ANCAPs. Are you in that kind of pro-Hoppy? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So they're just like, hey, screw those guys. Don't chuck them out of helicopters. It's like, whew, okay. That's harsh.
Well, it is, but I mean, look at what the far left is wanting to do. I mean, they're seeking to impose their values by any means necessary. They even have organizations called By Any Means Necessary. And I've seen YouTube videos. It was funny. There's one where some guy sort of taunting Antifa as he's walking by, say like, "Oh, don't you know that communism, killed 100 million people in the 20th century? Like, how many people?" Oh, and I think the guy actually had like a communist flag or something. Yeah. They do all the time. And he asked him like, "Oh, so how many millions of people are you guys gonna kill to get your way this time?" Yeah. And the guy just says, "As many as we need to." Yeah. Or by any means necessary.
I saw that. Yeah. I did see that. That's why we need police. That's why we need a government. Keep them suppressed. Well, so they don't just kill the capitalists and take all the property.
That's why we need helicopter squadrons.
Helicopter squad. Fuel is very expensive, I hear.
Yeah, but it's such a magnificent, elegant way of doing it. I mean, it's just a meme, but yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, that is sort of what it comes down to. And so I do see your point, or at least I'm interpreting your point as being that you're gonna have to employ something that might as well be called a state one way or the other, whether you call them government helicopters or Hoppian helicopters or ANCAP helicopters,
the capitalist
or alt-right
faction
helicopters. At the end of the day, violence.
It comes down to force. Conflicts do come down to force, not reason. And unfortunately, that's just the truth of the world.
100%.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ideally we use reason to avoid conflicts, but at the same time, reason doesn't always work, and conflicts do happen.
And if they achieve majority, the socialists achieve majority, then they change the country, they control the law, they change it into a socialist social order, and we just get oppressed. That's what happens.
Well, that's why
so it's a numbers game. It actually is a numbers game.
It's 100% a numbers game.
Right.
I mean, like none of our societies will come about without some sort of democratic majority deciding that that's how we want to live.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's all just big government status, like the minarchists are going to flounder just as bad as the ANCAPs.
Yeah, we're.
You know,
I
it's
mean,
just- obviously
and we
it's
have been. We have been. People say, "Hey, the Libertarian Party hasn't done anything in 45 years," and it's like, yeah, we're outnumbered by a lot. And
Yeah.
of course, there's a lot of other issues with that, but we're definitely outnumbered. So we just need to
Sure.
recognize that.
Right, and I think that's kind of why I sort of avoid these debates that we had today. Although I enjoyed it a lot and it was very educational. But just because I think we need to, you know, and I've used this metaphor 1,000 times, and people are probably getting tired of hearing about it, but I call it the Liberty Bus. And I feel like we're all kind of on the Liberty Bus, and we all have different stops along the way.
Yeah.
And
I
your
thought it was like the Liberty train, dude.
I've heard it as a train. I've heard the train
the bus,
analogy.
dude. Did
I
you see that school bus graphic I made? It was fucking awesome.
Yeah, and you can get off at the stop that you want.
Yeah.
I don't like that analogy. I don't use that one. Because when you're
because
describing
you suck, dude.
when you're describing your ideal to other
Because you're a
people,
goddamn communist.
yeah, and you're trying to
Kyle
say this is
Wagner.
what a free society should look like.
Yeah.
You know, I'm describing a role of government. You're describing private enforcement agencies. We have a different vision, and there's a different. I look at it as a fork in the road right now. We have a different strategy. Like a minarchist, we're trying to get elected. We're trying to control the law.
But there's- I mean,
and some ANCAPs are on board with
Yeah,
that. Some
see, I don't know,
ANCAPs,
man.
which I find to be contradictory. You're like, you're going to be an anarchist, but you want to get into a position of political power.
Well,
but they
that's-
kind of just
Right.
they do
well,
it
I mean,
anyway.
Ethan can kind of
Well-
explain more about that because he's sort of.
No, I am on board with that position. For me, you know, my ideal, you know, is Ancapistan, but I'm also realistic and understand that that's not going to happen anytime soon. Probably not in my lifetime, if ever. That said, if we had a true, you know, my objection to minarchism is not that I would be fine with a minarchist state. My objection is that a state never remains in minarchy. You know, it always perpetually grows. That, and I don't want to debate that here, but I think that's one of the problems. And you've brought up some excellent points to which I maybe Ancapistan would suffer from all those same problems anyway, because you functionally have things that are more or less a state anyway. But if we truly had a constitutional republic, if we actually lived in 1782, and we didn't have the last 300 years of nonsense. I can't even fucking do math. 200 plus years of bullshit. Then I'd be on board. If we really did have nothing but police, courts, and military, and taxes that were equivalent of, like, let's say 1%, 2% of your income or whatever, I would say, you know what, that's pretty damn good. I'm gonna leave good enough alone.
We would be very lucky to get anywhere close to that in our lifetimes. Really?
Well, yeah, no,
really.
and I totally understand that. So, I mean, I have no opposition to minarchists that they're going to go every bit as far as is realistic as I would want to go anyway. So there's no real point in combating them. We're never going to get back to 1782.
Yeah.
So even if we can just get back to, say, 1910.
If you want to argue about methodology, that's a different thing. But I'm just talking about what that society looks like. What that society looks like as it moves. God damn it! I can't talk. You can't add. I can't talk. As it moves towards what I would see as my end goal, and what Ethan would probably agree with, and then yours is further up. But we're sort of on the same path as far as like what that looks like, as far as like getting rid of things like foreign interventions,
welfare state,
the welfare state,
monetary sound money,
the drug war,
Yep.
Yeah. So. That's all I mean. I mean, obviously, we're going to have different methods. Like, you're obviously going to be more political.
Yeah, and that's the thing with anarchy is a lot of it deters people from participating in the political process and from voting. I think Ethan said he hasn't voted in a long time. Like, whereas as a minarchist, I'm like, oh my God, we need every vote we can get. Like, that's the whole goal is to get votes.
I mean, I voted.
Hey, do votes make you moist?
I'm not sure how to answer that. No, but
Depends on
I am
who's
trying to
voting for.
encourage more people who are libertarian or liberty-minded to run for office and to vote and to really participate. And a lot of it's not real glamorous. Like, I was out putting signs out for the Libertarian Party on Election Day, you know, just in the ground. It's a lot of work, but politics is a lot of it's just about showing up. So I did want to say, as far as minarchism leads to big government, you say that, but it's like I view politics as like a struggle, a tug of war, constant tug of war between sort of the big government types and the small government types. And anarchy or Ancapistan is no better check against big government than minarchism, because people can easily organize a government. It's just like a committee or something. It's just an organization of people that come together. And they're like, okay, you 5 are in charge. And then all of a sudden you have a hierarchy. You have a government over those people. So, like, how would you prevent people from organizing a new government as an ANCAP?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think that's sort of why I conceded earlier that, you know, it would just be a semantical argument of, as far as, you know, Ancapistan actually existing tangibly and functioning.
Yeah.
Even if you call it another name, functionally you're going to have things that are operating like a state fundamentally anyway, and so you haven't really changed much from other than the nomenclature from
I mean,
a
I mean, other than there would not be a monopoly.
Yeah, well, then, like, the progressives would organize, you know, and they would organize as maybe a militia or some sort of fighting force, and they would start trying to take over.
At which point, everybody else has to unite under one other banner in order to smite the
progressive threat.
At which point, you fundamentally have a state just by a different name. So I think that's a really good point. I mean, I do think it's still important to have an ideal. You know,
that's sort of
from which you sort of check your policy positions, your strategy positions, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I do think it's important to have an ideal, and so I do think Ancapistan is a good ideal to start from. But then once you get into the real world, as far as actual policy, actual strategy, what you're actually tangibly doing in the world,
you should come to statism. It's better.
Come to the dark side.
No, it's a lot more socially acceptable. Like, you don't feel bad about standing up for the national anthem. And we didn't talk about Memorial Day yet, but I wanted to talk about like Memorial Day is a big day for libertarians because a lot of them hate the military and they hate the flag. And I saw a meme on Liberty Memes where they like they fold the flag up and throw it in the trash can.
That
and
was a high triggering rate on that one.
High triggering rate on that one, exactly. And so when we're trying to get somewhere politically and we're turning off a lot of people who, you know, it's a disrespect thing. They feel disrespected. They feel the country's disrespected. And
but that's going back to tactics.
Tactics, yeah. I think it's bad politics.
Yeah.
I think it's bad politics
like,
to post a meme like that under a Liberty banner.
Sure.
You know.
I mean, we had Arvin Vora on here.
Yeah.
Last week.
It's another good example of.
And I sort of, while I agreed with what he was saying, on a fundamental level, you know, where he's talking about, you know, his argument was basically saying that you went into the military to get the government to pay for your schooling and pay for other things is not an excuse if you find the military to be immoral, if you find the military actions to be immoral.
Yeah.
But the way he said it was not. It didn't
the
come off that way.
military is immoral. That's sort of what the message that was conveyed to all these veterans is. The military is immoral. And Arvin, I listened to that podcast, and he does believe he wants to dismantle the public education, which we would also support privatizing education. But he wants to dismantle the apparatus of force, which is the state, which is where I would disagree with him. Right. You know, the Army protects our society from threats. Now we can debate the fact that maybe there aren't that many big major real threats in the world. You know, if you're not actually out there trying to start them, if you're not picking fights, but you know, I wouldn't be in agreement with that. Like, I think that armed forces are a vital function for protecting your society from external threats.
Sure. But I think the point that I don't know if he was. I mean, he probably does believe that exactly what you were saying.
He said we want to dismantle the state's monopoly on force,
right?
Dismantle the state's
100%.
apparatus of force.
The best way
abolish the military,
right? And so do I, and I think the rest of us do. But
the
point that should have been made, and and what I'm kind of trying to get at with like the Liberty Bus or like the the tactic thing is we should be criticizing. We should start off just criticizing the foreign interventionism.
Yeah, the philosophy. Not you really cannot insult the military forces in this country, and unless you want to really trigger everybody. Like then, if you're not trying to be popular, if you're trying to be an edgelord, that's fine. I don't like that. Like I don't want that. That's counterproductive to my goals, which is to grow the Libertarian Party. And I also support the Libertarian Republicans. I want to clarify that. Like I'm like, hey, great, we have a voice in the Republican Party. There's a lot of antagonism between the two, and I'm like, oh, that's great. Maybe we should have a Democratic Liberty Caucus as well, so that they get to hear those ideas during their primary. If you could. It's hard to do. It's admittedly hard to do because we're so far from them. But, you get somebody up on stage with Bernie and Hillary, and maybe they're a liberty-leaning Democrat, and they hear some new ideas. I like Tulsi Gabbard has been saying some great stuff. Yeah. So,
as far as foreign policy, yeah.
Foreign policy,
yeah.
I should clarify.
Yeah.
But we want to get our ideas expressed and conveyed through politics as many different channels as possible. Yeah. And
we always say on here, you catch more flies with honey, or bees with honey, flies with honey. So it's like, okay, yeah, maybe we do believe that the whole government should be dismantled, but obviously just shouting that into the void or just shouting it into the echo chambers that we all live in now isn't going to do any good. If we want to complete our goals, we have to sort of lure people in. We have to get them on the whole drug wars are bad. We shouldn't be throwing people in jail for pot, and then we shouldn't be throwing people in jail for heroin, and and then with the wars, it's like, do we really need to be bombing the Middle East? It seems like we continuously are fucking around that region and just creating more shit. Can get people... Hold on, let me just finish real quick.
Sure.
But when we can get people on that train or on that, believing in that stuff, then we can sort of work on them and say, like, well, hey, how much government do we really need? Yada, yada, yada. So, I mean, in that sense, our sort of tactics, I think, ought to align. And they don't. They don't for a lot of people. Like, Liberty Memes doesn't really give a shit about that. I love Liberty Memes, but that's just not their tactic. Yeah. So I don't think it's necessarily that effective in a sense, but...
Yeah, I'm being more political, and I'm thinking politically, and I don't want to trigger people's tribalism or nationalism or patriotism. Yeah. Like, I want to be on Team America, and which is a good thing because America has a great history and tradition of liberty.
America,
yeah. We were founded in a classical liberal tradition.
And suck on my balls.
Kyle
Wagner. Fuck yeah.
Well, I think Bergman can speak more to this, but you can talk about what Carl Hess says about America, about the country and the. Oh, what's that quote that you like?
Yeah, fucking Carl Hess. Yeah, when he's talking about like anarchism in America, and he's like there's kind of like the cool thing about America is kind of like there is like a fundamental to question authority. We were bred out of revolution.
There's a strain of liberty in America. Yeah. Freedom is one of our highest values. It's not a value everywhere.
Well, he's talking about anarchist tendencies in America. Mm-hmm. And then he said it's flawed by one thing, and it's patriotism.
Oh,
yeah. And when you think about it, though, patriotism is like the egg from which wars are hatched.
But that's one part of it. But then the other thing he says is basically looking at America as the country of America, not the nation of America, like separating the land masses and the history and the people from the state.
Yeah,
that's the one I was hoping you were gonna say. But
dude,
that was good
both
too.
of them are cool, dude.
Yeah.
Has rules.
But and that's the thing when it comes to the flag, which we're gonna get to, is what does the flag?
Flagets.
What does the flag really represent? Does the flag represent the government of the U.S. or does it represent the history of the U.S. and the people of the U.S. and the land that the borders of the U.S. Like what is it? What does it really represent? And it seems like
Or is it just gang colors?
Or is it just gang colors?
Well, we can shape what it represents, and we can use it to our advantage. And I like to use it to say it represents freedom and liberty and a great country and all that kind of stuff. So like, it's just, you know, it is a piece of cloth, but we can use that symbol to our advantage, especially given the history of it, which it, you know, has a proud history. Somewhat.
Yeah, my concern though is when people,
despite some blotches,
the people that I call flaggots,
yeah,
are the people who, you know, praise the flag and praise the military, but then they just like everything else is like, oh, give away my rights for this, give away my rights to the surveillance state, you know, give away my rights to police.
I think a flaggot is anybody that wears like an American flag.
Anyone that wears an American flag?
Yeah.
I'm checking my clothing right now.
Okay.
Well, I mean,
that's not how I term it, though. I term it as like people that worship the flag but don't actually care about what it stands for in the sense that we're talking about, freedom and liberty and that sort of thing.
There's a difference between whether you love the government or whether you love the principles.
Yeah.
You know, and I think you're absolutely right. You know, America was founded on very unique principles. I mean, I think you'd have to be historically ignorant to not appreciate that America. You know, it's American exceptionalism. People like to mock and deride that term and say, "Oh, you think you're so fucking special because the land you grew up on." It's like, no, that's not what American exceptionalism is. American exceptionalism is the fact that this is the only country that was founded on classical.
Dude?
Yeah, like I said,
it's the only country that was founded on classical liberal principles from the get-go, and that is an exception in history, and that is absolutely
it's an advantage. It's an advantage to being here.
Well, yeah, and I think that does in fact make America exceptional, and our history demonstrates and proves that we are the most exceptional country that's ever existed in terms of our being an economic powerhouse.
Dude?
He keeps bringing up all these bad examples. Yes, we have some black marks in our history.
Yes,
we haven't been a perfect country for sure.
Yes, but there's no question that we've been infinitely better than the vast majority of countries in regards to all these things, including human rights. I mean, people like to bring up slavery. Well, slavery was the de facto way that all humans lived for thousands of years everywhere, without exception. In fact, Americans and the British are the only people that single-handedly, pretty much, ended slavery worldwide for all of humanity. So this notion that people complain about British colonialism and American slavery are complete fucking morons, because we are the only people that actually ever did anything to change that after millennia and millennia of that being the de facto standard across all human society.
You really don't sound like an ANCAP.
Well, see, again, that's why I say earlier, I mean, I think there is an ANCAP ideal. I do agree with, you know, all the philosophy. I mean, Hoppe is, you know, ANCAP. You know, I do agree with all the Rothbard, the Hoppe, the Mises, you know, and everything else, Molyneux and whatever.
Mises was a minarchist.
Well, yeah, but I'm saying, I mean, I'm on board with all these principles. But there is a reality, and I think this is what you speak to with minarchy, of that there are real physics to how this actually works in the world. At the end of the day, you know, ANCAPs will point out that might does not make right. Of course it doesn't, but it still is what fucking wins every time.
Might determines outcomes, is my saying. You know, might does determine what.
Absolutely. And so I mean, I don't know if you've seen me on here before, but I personally, and I think there's plenty to criticize about Trump, absolutely, but overall, I fucking love Donald Trump, and they rag on me like a motherfucker because of that. They say, "Oh, you're not a fucking anarchist." Well, but I love what Donald Trump represents as far as being anti-establishment, and as far as a lot of the principles and the stuff he talks about. Now, is he actually executing all these principles and everything that he said in the campaign trail? You know, well, maybe not. But overall, as far as being an actual force of power that is actually tangibly affecting the world that we live in a direction that I largely agree with. I love him. And the fact that he pisses off the left. I mean, I do see the left as the number one enemy of Americans and humans in general.
What would you label Trump? What would you call him?
A pragmatic... I mean, I don't. He's a pragmatic populist. You know, he's not principled.
I would call him a nationalist. You know, he likes protectionism. Yeah, America first.
Well, yeah. No,
I
there
call
is
him a
nationalism.
nationalist. Yeah.
And I don't object to nationalism the way that I used to, because I do think that, nationalism is the chemotherapy that we need to use against the cancer of leftism, social justice, communism, socialism, and all that other stuff.
It's a reaction. You
Yes.
reacted. You saw how crazy they are, and it pushed you further to, into a different direction. You're like, whoa, we have to get hard on these people because they're going to tear our society apart.
Yeah, no, I will readily identify as, people complain about left libertarians and this and that. I do think there's a left-right divide, and I am very decidedly and explicitly on the right side of things.
I get that.
To call me, a neo-reactionary right-wing extremist is not inaccurate.
About an alt ANCAP.
Sure, I've never heard that term before,
Alt
but
ANCAP, nationalist ANCAP, I don't know.
I've never heard those terms, but I don't object to them on their face.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is, again, I still have the ANCAP ideal. I still believe in the non-aggression principle. I do believe that Hoppian argumentation ethics that Molyneux's UPB are absolutely true, objectively so, in a self-evident manner. But that doesn't change the physics of our world. And again, might determines outcomes, and something needs to be fucking done, because I absolutely do believe that we are facing existential threats, both politically and across a wide spectrum of however you want to slice society.
Yeah, I think you have to look at, the NAP or even utilitarian principles, whatever you have for those, in sort of a framework of, what was I going to say? Like it's sort of like a framework to pursue, but also being realistic about what's going on. Take for example, if there was a meteor headed towards the Earth right now, I would say fuck the NAP. We need to figure this thing out. So if we got to go ahead and just if we had to raise a whole bunch of taxes, or whatever,
if we have to go around and confiscate the gold.
Yeah, if we had to do it to save the planet, because you can't have the NAP unless there's human beings around. So, obviously there's always going to be exceptions. There's going to be weird sort of gray areas, all sorts of shit like that.
Sometimes you have to choose between two bad choices, and you just choose the best.
Right.
Even though it's not.
With the goal in mind that,
the greater good.
There's the greater, I don't know, I don't really like the term the greater good, but moving towards the ideal.
Yeah.
Moving towards the ideal.
Yeah.
So as long as whatever you're doing is ultimately in service of that, then I think you can justify it in a sense. So while I might not agree with Ethan that that's the way we should do it, I don't say, well, Ethan's like a fake libertarian now because he thinks Trump is moving us towards that.
Yeah, it's utilitarianism informed by idealism, I guess would be maybe one way of putting it.
Yeah.
And again, I think the existential threats that we face force us to get out of our fucking ideal all in our brains debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, nonsense, because this shit is really happening to us in real time. Right. And you look at Antifa and the social justice movements on campus, these things are getting straight up fucking violent at this point, and so that's a big problem.
Yeah, I see the need for a police presence, but have you participated in any of the hitting people with sticks and that kind of thing?
Like based stick man?
Yeah.
No, I haven't gone out to any sort of protests or rallies or anything.
I was at inauguration.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
How was that?
It was interesting. Yeah. That was when Antifa first kind of showed up on the scene.
Was that Black Bloc?
Yeah.
I think they call it Black Bloc. I think that's the tactic.
The tactic is called Black Bloc.
Black.
Yeah, all black, masks, all that shit. And they were...
and you were like, these people look like they can self-govern.
No, I was more like, I look like I need to have a gun to defend myself against these people.
Yeah. Maybe some police, too.
Maybe a private defense force.
I'd rather have a gun on myself than a cop down the street.
A cop on the phone, right?
But I would not object to either or both.
Yeah,
for sure.
And they destroy property. They want to rip down Starbucks and Bank of America and they hate corporations, which are businesses. Yeah, and they're very destructive.
Well, if they were the majority, we would certainly be in trouble.
Yeah, I've studied anarchist Spain. A little bit, Catalonia, which was that's their sort of flagship. Look, this can work, which it didn't last. It was very violent, very bloody, and they ultimately got taken over by fascists because they didn't have a national defense. Right. So, that vacuum of just no one dominating over that area, it just doesn't last. Somebody fills that hole and takes control of that territory.
Yeah, but these people also didn't have the correct principles, the correct principles underlying it to create a proper foundation.
Well, then
is what I would
that
argue.
gets into the "we need a new man," argument that the communists make.
We
which
need a
is
new
like,
man.
well, that was like the thing with Soviet Russia was like we need the new communist man, and that's why we need to eliminate millions of people that will not fall in line with these new ideals.
The communists have the same split between ANCOMs, anarcho-communists, and like Stalin kind of Soviet state communists.
Yeah.
And I would think the state ones are more dangerous because they understand the need to take control of the state and then actually impose communism.
Right.
But they fight each other bitterly, the ANCOMs and the state communists. They're tankies. Sometimes they're called tankies because they like the tanks of the Soviet Union, I guess.
Yeah, no, I was just talking about in terms of the underlying principles behind communism versus capitalism or whatever you want to call it. I was saying like that it's going to be more likely to collapse. It isn't necessarily the anarchic nature of it. It's the not being able to produce or have economic calculation or any of that shit.
Yeah.
But this is all sort of theoretical.
Without the state, they're just a bunch of kids dressed in black, basically breaking windows.
Yeah.
If they control the state and they control the state apparatus, then they have the soldiers behind them, the police behind them, and then they seize property.
Super dangerous.
But then they bring it under the state. That's what happens every time communism is tried. Is 100% public employment, 100% public ownership, and it's all controlled by the Communist Party.
Yeah.
So it's a dictatorship of the Communist Party, but they don't. Of course,
I mean,
they don't sell
like
it
Evan
that way.
says, I mean, if the weapon of the state is there, you don't want the commies to wield that shit.
Well, it's us or them. That's what it's going to be because they can organize and form a new state or what you would consider a state. They can organize armies. They can organize any of that stuff. So it's just our faction against their faction. Whoever,
But I mean, you could also make the argument. I think Rothbard does that the commies wouldn't really be able to amass any sort of military because it would just collapse in on itself.
It's just a numbers game. I mean, if you have more people, you just outnumber.
Yeah, but you have to produce.
Well, or more resources. I
and-
mean, the U.S. beat the Soviet Union, economically. I mean, it was an arms race, but the reason we won the arms race was because of our economy. It wasn't for lack of the Soviets throwing everything they possibly could, including the blood and guts of their own people into their war machine. And they still lost because we just had more fucking money because our economy makes more sense and works better.
And Mises would say, they still had foreign prices to do a little bit of calculation. If you had a communist world and you had no market prices whatsoever, they would have no idea what they had, what the demand was, because you don't have consumer demand.
Yeah.
You don't have prices on stuff, so It's like, what do we make? Just whatever we arbitrarily decide to make, and sometimes that stuff nobody really wants.
Yeah.
Or maybe that one Communist Party member wants it for his benefit, but no consumers want that. It's not a productive economic endeavor. So.
You could do what the zeitgeist people would want to do and program a supercomputer that just decides what everybody should get.
Fucking robot communism. It's the dumbest shit ever.
What is it? Post-scarcity.
Yeah, post-scarcity. Like this idea that there's such a thing as post-scarcity
fully
just blows my
automated
mind.
Post-scarcity luxury communism. I think that's the full. I've heard that
Luxury
phrase.
communism.
Yeah,
Oh
they've
my
heard that.
jeez.
They're like, the robots are
Well,
just
it's
going to
like
make everything.
they think it's just going to be like Star Trek.
Right. Yeah. And I'm like, who's going to build the robots? And they're like, other robots. And I'm like, who's going to build them?
They've
Who's
obviously
gonna
never heard of
maintain
an
the robot?
infinite regression.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. Well, let me throw this out because I find all this stuff very interesting. This is a little detached, but you brought up well, you really want police there to handle like say Black Bloc Antifa.
Yeah.
Well, I would argue, and this reminds me. Apparently, this is I think it's a relatively recent quote from Noam Chomsky, who said, we really don't want this to devolve into violence because the right is a lot better at it than we are.
Oh.
Which is
They're both good at it.
Well, yeah, but I think there's an argument to be made that the right, at least here in the U.S., is a lot better at violence than a bunch of
the state is the best at violence, and
Well,
we want
sure.
the state to be on the correct side of defending property rights and maintaining order.
Sure. Yes.
We don't want. I think Jeffrey Tucker wrote an article in Fee about the rise of the political street warrior. We're seeing Antifa fighting, and the right doesn't have a name. I don't think the Stickman Army. I don't know. What would you call
Trumps.
the right wing? The
Usually they just call it
Trumpers.
Trumpers
Well,
or
Trumpers.
Trumpkins.
Trump fighters.
The alt-right would refer to them as the alt-light, is a term that I've heard bandied about
alt-light?
for people like Based Stickman.
Light. I would think that'd be harder because you're actually willing to go out and hit people. You
Well,
know, like
they-
you're even more hardcore than.
They call them that because they're not on board with alt-right principles. That's a whole esoteric thing that I don't think is worth getting into.
All that.
So, but my point, and perhaps this is just simply anecdotal and doesn't mean much, but in these instances, like the based stickman versus Antifa scuffles, I would argue that the police. Now, certainly in places like Berkeley, there's just outright corruption where they're told to stand down and let the Antifa run around.
That was crazy. They were interviewing the cops, and the cops wouldn't answer. He's like, "Why aren't you doing anything?"
He's like, "You'll have to go ask my boss, or ask public
so
relations."
You don't really know, but they're probably under orders not to intervene.
I think it's pretty easy to conclude they were. But even outside of that, the point I want to make is in these Antifa scuffles, let's just call it, right versus left for simplicity's sake. The people on the right can and would. I mean, again, these Antifa are just a bunch of scrawny loser teenagers, basically, for the most part.
Anybody can shoot a gun.
Fair enough. But I feel like if the police weren't there, I feel like the police were more of a restraining factor against the right-wing factions who have no interest. They have families, jobs, etc. Like, they can't afford to go to jail. Whereas the people on the left, I mean, these are, basically losers that have nothing else, nothing
I mean,
to
they were
lose or
throwing
whatever.
shit at the cops when I saw them. When I saw them at the inauguration, there was a line of these black bloc people, or, Antifa performing the black bloc, and, rows of cops with riot gear. Now, obviously, they knew the cops weren't going to shoot at them, which is, I guess, the benefit of having, like, a progressive society where the cops can't just mow you down for no reason.
Yeah. But my point being that,
but hold on, let me finish, though.
Sure.
But, so, so you have that going on, which, so in these guys' mentalities, they know there's not going to be any repercussion. Yeah, I mean, if they go after one guy that throws a brick, they might get that guy. But the whole point of them wearing masks is so that they can't identify them. So, like, they could run. Obviously, they'll get the one guy. But the rest of them can run away, and they can hide, and they can, be little bitches.
yeah.
So it's like...
It's very guerrilla.
Whereas, and I'm not defending the rightists or whatever in the situation, per se, but they're usually coming in, they're wearing their fucking MAGA hats, they're wearing their base stickman outfit, but I think his face is... What's that?
They go there to fight too.
Oh, they're going there to fight, but they're not going there.
Fighters are, college-age kids that are like, let's go. We're going to
fuck
go to a
people up.
rally, but we know Antifa is going to be there.
Yeah,
it's going to be a rumble.
Oh,
it's
totally.
almost like,
but
it's like LARPing, but a little more serious.
Sure, but I haven't. To Ethan's credit, I haven't seen those rightists damaging private property.
That's probably true, and
I did see that.
True.
I was like right next to the Starbucks that got smashed in. I was right next to the Bank of America
because the left is
I
anti-capitalist.
saw them light that fucking like limo on fire, like.
That an immigrant owned, apparently.
I agree with the way the left perceives it, which is that capitalism is a system, and these riot police are actually protecting the capitalist property, and so it's all part of this evil capitalist empire. So they hate the police, and they hate the businesses and the corporations.
Yeah.
And I agree with that perception. I see those riot police, that line of riot police, as the defenders of civilization against the crazy, destruction of these anarchist nutjobs.
I mean,
Well,
yeah, I mean that. So you're
That's how I perceive
so
it.
you perceive it the same way that they do.
Yeah, which
but,
is that
but
the
you
state-
perceive it as a good, whereas they perceive it as an evil.
The state protects capitalism. Right. That's how I see it.
I mean, I would say the state protects itself, but
I mean, they're protect. They should be protecting life and property from violent
I mean,
assaults.
I think they're protecting their own interests, just like all humans do. Ultimately,
I mean, even if it's only incidental, they do to some extent
I'm not saying
protect life and property.
I'm not saying that they don't. I'm just saying that's as a abstraction. That's not how I see them. In the sense that, I mean, they don't go to work every day like, I need to defend capitalism today. But by proxy, they're defending the capitalist system in your view.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm just saying, like, by proxy, I think they're defending the status quo, statism, whatever you want to call it, the establishment. But
Sure.
yes, they do defend life and property incidentally.
Yeah, they'll arrest thieves or carjackers
Sure, yeah.
or vandals. People that destroy, people that steal. They're
Yeah.
not always great at it, but the system is there. I mean, there is a
Sure,
justice
but they're
system.
also doing the same thing to people who are just using marijuana or
I mean, that's a
selling
policy.
marijuana.
That's a
or-
simple policy change. It's just like slavery. Like, okay, we can change the law, and then that law goes away, and then you can smoke legally.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
Look,
I'm
and
not-
they've done it, and that's a very simple change compared to abolishing the entire legal structure of society and saying we're going to be ANCAP now. We're not going to have law and order as we know it. That
Sure.
is a huge change that
Of
you're
course.
proposing.
That's why I always say I would never push the ANCAP button right away, or the anarchy button right away.
Yeah.
I mean, that would
I
just be
wouldn't push it
disastrous.
at all, but that's
well, I know you wouldn't,
obviously
but I'm
a
just saying
difference
that
of
I
opinion.
wouldn't push it right away. Obviously, you know, it's got to be a progressive thing. It's got to be an incremental, step by step, and then you know maybe we get to minarchy world and we realize, and then we try and peel that back, and some shit gets fucked up. We're like, you know what? Never mind. We don't want that. Let's go back, and I'm okay with that. Like, all I care about is the principles. Like, I'm not necessarily an adherent to like, well, if we're not living in Kapistan, let's just scrap the whole human experiment because we're fucked. I mean, if you need a certain level of the state to have maximum nap, then okay, then fine. I don't see the evidence for that right now, but I am open to it, and if it happens in my lifetime, I'm willing to be convinced that that's the case. But in the meantime, let's incrementally and intelligently, let's move towards that. Because it could be, because here's the thing, if you move too fast, you know, like if you just ended the welfare state tomorrow and just had millions of poor people just running through the streets, that would probably be bad, right? Because people would say, like, look what's happening. It's chaos. It's chaotic. We need more welfare. You guys were wrong. Instead, if we just gradually take away programs and take away, like, the ones that people are relying on less first.
You have to be smart about it.
You have to be smart
cannot
about
just
it.
pull the rug out
No.
from under people that are literally 1 month away, one welfare check away from losing their housing.
Exactly.
And have a family just thrown out on the street. You know, I mean, this stuff is very, very tricky when you actually talk about putting into practice. But if we lived in minarchy, I have an idea that I don't even think Ancapistan would have ever been conceived. I think they wouldn't have had such a negative reaction to the state to say we need to abolish this, that it's not good, because it would be functioning as it should in a capitalist system, which is protecting life and property. So I would say if the state was doing that, why on earth would you abolish it if it was just protecting life and property? That's what we need.
Yeah, well, that's why earlier, you know, I said, you know, if we actually had real minarchy, you know, of course, military police, and it stayed that way.
It's hard to keep it that
Yeah, that's
way.
the problem.
You have to it's
yeah.
a constant struggle with the progressives and us. I would call us liberals, classical liberals, to try to maintain. We pull towards smaller government. They pull toward bigger government, and it's a tug of war. And ANCAPs are like not participating. A lot of them, not some of them are, but the non-political ones are like sitting on the side watching us have tug of war. And I'm like, no, guys.
But there are other methods.
There
There are other methods besides politics, though. I mean, there is spreading the ideals, and I think that's a very important thing. I mean, if you can't convince people why they should be pulling your way, then what's the point? And I mean, there's different ways to do that. You can come at it from the economic argument. You can come at it from the philosophical argument, the utilitarian argument. I mean, whatever you want to do, but that's the other side of the coin. It's not necessarily like going out and getting people to vote, because I mean, how do you get them to vote? That's sort of what I'm saying. Is like,
I'm trying to get you guys to.
I
don't know if you got that or not.
I mean, I voted for Gary Johnson.
All right.
And I mean, there wasn't anything worthwhile to vote for as far as like propositions or anything that I saw on the Maryland ballot. So I didn't really vote for any of that shit. But yeah,
Well,
I mean, I'm not opposed. I'm not opposed to voting. I'm not one of those ANCAPs.
There are ANCAPs, and Ethan said he's a voting is violence kind of guy, and I'm and I obviously
I said that's one of many reasons. The overarching reason is just I don't feel like it, and I don't feel like it's going to make a difference here in Maryland, at least certainly on a national level. As far as voting for president, there's no risk of Maryland going for a Republican. Although, as I also brought up, I mean, we did actually vote in a Republican governor. Mm-hmm. Now, he's totally fucking useless as far as a Republican goes, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You know, other than maybe he's just not as bad as, you know, the Democrat would have been. There is something to be said for that. But I don't want to mistakenly give the impression that like I fully believe in voting is violence, and so that's why I take a principled stand.
Yeah.
That's.
Were you a Ron Paul guy?
Oh yeah.
So you voted for Ron Paul?
Oh yeah.
So
in 08 and 12.
If we could put up candidates that were better than Gary, you might be motivated to vote even just because you really like that guy.
Potentially,
even
yeah.
if he's going to lose, you're still like I was voting for Ron Paul one way or the other. It didn't matter to me that.
Well, and even when I was voting, I was only voting in primaries, you know, not the general.
Yeah, and that's where the LP actually comes in, because if Liberty Republicans don't get through the primaries, we have a fallback. We actually still have candidates in the general, and you hope that they're principled libertarians. We've had trouble getting, really good candidates, but it gives people, it gives you another voice in the general election, another option, and people are going, what's libertarianism all about? Who's this guy?
So I just want to get back to the point I was trying to bring up before, as far as, the Antifa and right-wing scuffles that we've been seeing. The way I've seen it, and you may disagree, and I want to hear your thoughts, is that the police are really the police presence in those situations is more of a restraint on the right-wing factions than the left-wing factions. And that if, in the absence of police, if the right-wing factions felt no legal, repercussions by the police or whatever, they would be inflicting far greater and overwhelming violence against the left. And they would actually be, not just, loosely winning and, fighting back the Antifa, but they would actually be like stomping them out and, potentially, even killing them. I don't know. I'm not saying they should or anything like that. But so I see in those instances, it seems to me that in an all-out fight with, no cops around, the right wing would be beating the ever-loving shit out of the left.
It depends how many show up. I mean, if you got 1,000 Antifa and you have, 50 Trumpers, you're going to lose. It's a matter of numbers.
Well, so. The numbers, the Antifa, as far as I've seen, they have generally been in the minority as far as numbers as well.
If you outnumber them, then you're probably going to win. But
so your
if
argument
it's 50-50,
is
I don't know who's the better fighters, the better street fighters.
So I guess what would you argue then, that if there wasn't police presence, the left would be increasing their violence that much more beyond throwing bricks and hitting people in the head with bike locks?
Oh yeah, for sure.
And they would be bringing guns.
If there were no criminal repercussions, if there was no police, they would be much more violent. And you guys would be much more violent.
What about and so I guess that's sort of my point. But the right wingers have, for example, military veterans, people that have owned and shot guns their entire life, et cetera, et cetera. Where again, the left, these are basically just a bunch of loser commies with no jobs or maybe working in a fast food joint.
You shouldn't underestimate your opponents. Who knows what they got? Like I said, anybody can shoot a gun, anybody can buy an automatic or a semi-automatic weapon, and if violence escalates and you're willing to kill for your side, that's a faction war. That would be the chaos, to me, of anarchy, because the police sat it out and they just let these two factions fight it out, and that's chaos. So that's something I want to avoid. I want to maintain law and order, and that's where I want to talk about something that I have that's a controversial position, is property rights applied to public property. So when you have a public square or something like that, the rules for that area are set by the government, because the government technically owns that property, and they can say, these guys have a permit to be here, you do not have a permit to disrupt this event, so therefore the police force would be applied against Antifa for disrupting the scheduled event or what have you. So the property owner decides, even when the property owner is the government, who gets that space, and then that way you don't have the conflict. The police side with one side or the other, and you don't have the street fight.
I don't disagree with any of that. What's the argument there?
Just that property rights can apply to public property, government property as well, as far as they're the owner of that space and they set the rules. So
yeah, well, I think then you're sort of making a similar argument for why I'm a closed borders libertarian. Obviously, even as an ANCAP, of course you believe in borders. That's
private
sort of
borders.
Yeah, that's sort of like the essence of private property,
right? Which I would say also come from government, which is obviously controversial to people that believe in homesteading. But I think property rights come from law, where it's like, this is Ethan's little square of land, here's his little deed, and don't mess with him or we're gonna mess with you. So your property rights actually are protected by the state.
So
okay,
for you,
that's fair.
Government's like a big buddy.
It's not a buddy. That's not the word I would use, but it actually, it's a governing body. It enables us to peacefully coexist with each other by creating rules and enforcing those rules.
So then, do
a
you
pimp
believe
of
in
sorts.
you believe that in the government controlling the border, limiting immigration? That's a
Yeah,
valid function.
Yes, it is. And if you can't control your border, I mean, you can be completely overrun by an invading army or something if it's a war. I mean, let's say there's no border between the U.S. and Mexico. There's no reason why Mexican troops couldn't just flood in if it came to that. So I take Ron Paul's position on the borders, which is in Liberty Defined. I think everybody should read it. I think it's pretty sensible. You know, he talks about obviously that there's a lot of legal implications. Like, okay, let's say I have kids or I'm in Mexico, but I'm trying to send my kids across the border to attend a U.S. public school, but I don't want to pay taxes in the United States. Like, there's so many like legal implications with that border, and I don't think it's written in stone that we have to take everyone in that wants to come in. There can be, I think it should be easier. I'm pro-immigrant. I think immigrants contribute a lot as far as labor and stuff. I think immigrant workers are very important to our economy. I don't agree with coming over and utilizing our welfare system, not paying any taxes for roads, not paying any taxes for schools, and using all of our public services and getting automatic citizenship. I don't think that's what they do. I don't think they get automatic. But sometimes, what do they do with the amnesty thing, Obama's thing? That wasn't citizenship. I remember he went on the news and was like, the people that have been here for 7 years they're okay. Remember that?
I mean, I honestly I don't recall that specifically. I mean, I think
he gave him amnesty
from an executive position. I mean, that's not really. I'm guessing that was just sort of a policy of, I've told my Justice Department we're not going to enforce this stuff. But I mean, he obviously can't change the law. The fact is, they're still illegal, or illegal immigrants, whatever you want to call them. So, and I think also the huge issue, I think, is really the biggest issue. I mean, obviously, having open borders and a welfare state, I think, is just completely insane.
Yeah, I agree.
But what's more, as you pointed out earlier, I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to have democracy whether you like it or not. It's a numbers game.
That is true
and,
as well.
These are people that, by and large, overwhelmingly vote left at far higher rates than the current native U.S. population.
Do they vote? Are they even able to, immigrants? I mean, that's another thing you could say, okay, we'll have the immigration, but we're going to take away their ability to vote.
I mean, apparently,
you could do that.
There are many,
you can't do that because people don't want voter IDs.
Theoretically, we could legally change that so that, they weren't able to vote.
Well, I mean, theoretically, yeah.
But then you're creating second-class citizens. Then they're going to be pissed, 10 years down the line. They're going to be going, hey, I'm subject to all your laws. I'm living here. What is it called? Americanized, and you're still not letting me vote.
But you said they're not paying taxes. Right?
Yeah, that's...
So if they're not paying taxes under your rubric, they're not really citizens, right?
What if you could only pay vote if you pay taxes? It's like a voting tax.
I'd be all for that. I mean, I'm all for disenfranchising as many voters as possible myself.
I would agree. Like, I think we've pushed the everybody should vote narrative. I think that's a mistake. I think it's if you're informed and educated and then you should vote. And if you don't know
what if you had to pass like a test?
Right. If you don't know anything, then don't vote. And a lot of people actually do know the presidential candidates. Very few know anything about anything below that. Like, our political narrative is shaped at the presidential
Which
elections.
is sad because that's what impacts you the most.
Yeah. Well,
usually.
That's where it helps to have a party. You could say, hey, it's a libertarian party. If you know what libertarianism is, you can vote for that even though you just see the L. You don't know that person, but you can vote L.
I do want to point out, so you asked, do they vote? There have been lots of studies done on this, and of course it's hard to do because, they're illegals. Like, it's not documented directly. But and it's funny because, Donald Trump got in hot water over making a comment about millions of illegal votes. But there are many studies, a lot of which include, and these are huge sample sizes, including people that are illegal immigrants that are self-reporting that they did in fact vote. Yeah. And so all the estimates I've seen is that it's at least a few million that voted, for example, in the previous couple presidential elections.
You know what else is good is
which is significant. I mean, we're talking about like 10% of the vote or something approaching that being illegal immigrants. And of course, it's all in states that don't have voter ID laws, et cetera, which again, the only reason to oppose voter ID is to allow voter fraud, whether it's multiple votes or illegal immigrants voting, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, federalism can really help with that because if you take a lot of power away from the federal government, a lot of its roles away, and you push some of that stuff locally, say a really heavily Hispanic population in Southern California or Southern Texas, they can kind of have their own Hispanic lawmakers and laws that are in alignment with their culture. and not a separate country. They could still be part of the United States, but they would be more localized government, and that would be more satisfactory, I think, to people. Then they could have maybe a more progressive, if they're progressives. But you actually, it's a lot of just regular white Americans are Democrats as well, so you never wanted to downplay that. But you understand what I'm saying. If you localize the government,
but I mean,
it's less of a problem.
For example, if let's say hypothetically only white males were allowed to vote in the U.S., like the Democrats wouldn't have won an election like in the last 60 plus years. I mean, the voting patterns of different.
Is that right? I don't know if that's right.
I've seen lots of various stats and info. Believe me, I'm not an expert. I'm not, I don't have a bibliography ready or anything. But I have seen in lots of places from all sorts of different sources, all sorts of different statistics, that if nothing else, show that voting patterns are very are hugely disparate among different demographics. So women vote left very significantly more than men do. Non-white races vote left way more significantly than whites do, and we're not talking about a couple points here and there. I mean, just look at Black Americans vote. It's like 80-90% plus. For Democrats.
We don't want to write those votes off. I'm
not saying we should.
I think that's a voting. Those are voting blocks. Liberalism or libertarianism is very it has broad appeal. We should be going after the Hispanic vote, the minority vote, the inner city votes. Like, talk about the war on drugs, talk about civil liberties. We can reach those people.
But at the same time, if we have, let's say unbridled immigration from Mexico or unbridled immigration and from let's say the Middle East, with these quote unquote refugees, etc. It's a pretty well established statistical fact that they vote overwhelmingly left and far more than the current native population does. So you are, by definition, if you want to say that any Mexican can come in anytime they want, regardless of whether that's principled or not or whatever, the fact is that is going to skew elections to the left.
It's ultimately a war of ideas as well. Like, I don't think you can control the results of elections by controlling the demographics. That's really tough to do. I think you have to just fight the war of ideas and be like, this is our ideal for a society.
But does it help to invite in a bunch of people who already disagree with you and are already going to be voting in the hopes that one day you'll change their mind?
I mean, the way I kind of feel about it is I already disagree with like 98% of the country, so I'm just like, okay,
Well, but certainly your typical Republican voter is going to be a lot closer to your ideal than
they drive me nuts too. Everyone.
Well, sure. I mean, and I think there's a big difference between more principled Republicans like Justin Amash or something.
Well,
something
I
like
really
that,
like Amash.
Compared to say, sure, and Amash is no Thomas Massey or Ron Paul, whatever.
He's close enough for me. I'm going to tell you.
Sure, no,
compared to what we've got,
and I'm with you, and compare that to say like a Paul Ryan or far worse, John McCain or Lindsey Graham. I mean, those guys are just.
Yeah, I love Massey. I think he's great. Rand was a little conservative for me, actually. I'm in the Ron Paul camp, and unfortunately, Ron Paul spoiled me, and now every candidate gets judged against him, and I'm like, well, he's not Ron Paul.
But I mean, I even Rand Paul. I mean, he's a lot closer in our direction than the rest of the Senate.
Yeah, I agree.
So I don't think it's worthwhile to criticize Rand Paul when you've got Lindsey Graham.
I think
and
Rand
John
Paul's
McCain
a lot closer than you actually probably think he is too. I think he's playing, kind of like what you're trying to do, which is like a tactical game.
Yeah.
Of course, he's going a little bit further than you probably
more
go.
Moderate, I would say, and more toward the conservative.
But I think there's no way that he doesn't share most of the philosophy that his dad has. Like, I just don't see how that's possible.
I don't know. I can only judge him by what he says.
Well, and that's fine.
I was up to like 30 strikes against him during his campaign. I'm like, man, I don't know if this guy's actually even on board. Like, he sounds really conservative, but. I'm with you there. It dampened my support, but at the same time, it didn't matter because he dropped out before the primaries even came to Maryland anyway. So we never would have gotten a chance to vote for him in the primaries. Yeah. But I wasn't out waving flags over bridges like I was for Ron.
Did you vote for anybody in the primaries?
No, I'm a registered libertarian now. I gave up on them. And obviously the Liberty Republicans will yell at me, much as the way I yell at you guys. It's like, you're not helping, right? Well, you're not helping the LP, and they're like, well, you're not helping the Libertarian Republicans. So I could theoretically
they could
still be
accuse
registered.
you of being, an idealist
Yeah.
because
They
here
do.
you have an established party that wins elections and just won the presidency.
Yeah.
Yet you're trying to go for this third party that got what 4% of the vote.
And it's not just
even, I don't think.
and I could vote Libertarian in the general and not be a registered Libertarian. I could be registered Republican and
Right.
still supporting Libertarians in public through activism and everything else. And then I could vote in the primaries. And we actually have a Libertarian Republican running for county council in Baltimore County, where we are right now. So I'd like to support him, but I'm also involved with the Libertarian Party, so I don't know that I don't know how much I can do for him. But I like the guy,
Yeah.
and if I could vote in the Republican
What's his
primaries, Eric Lofstad. Yeah.
Check them out.
Yeah. So, yeah, I like Liberty Republicans. I think they're great. I completely understand people making that choice.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just better to have allies than enemies. And the more allies you can find, the better. So, I
Yeah.
mean...
But they're going, you're taking votes away from us and taking them to the LP.
Yeah, no, in
I'm
that scenario,
I'm like,
it doesn't
all right,
work, yeah.
Well, I get that, but, like, what happens when you lose your primary and then we're in the general looking at, McCain, Obama, or whatever, and we have no candidate. So,
Right. Makes sense.
did you guys want to wrap it up, or do you want to keep going? We barely touched on the topic.
Yeah, we haven't even gotten to like any of, the topics.
it's already like 10 o'clock.
Yeah. So I think that's it for tonight. Until next time, we've got t-shirts over at libertariancountry.com, and if you type in the code PRL or the code PRL podcast, you'll receive a 10% off discount. And we are always accepting article submissions over at the dailyliberator.com. Until next time, live free or die.
Statism's footprint is the blood that is shed, drenching the flags on the tax bombs in red. Poisons by a few at the expense of the many, sold to the gods and the death machine. You can't justify killing by economic gain. For God, country, and democracy, you can put freedom and gunpoint in a fine land. We support the troops, then bring them home. I believe that you will do the best for you. And I believe that we have the power, I hate the state, and I know I'm a slave. We can make a break the power. Society owes individuals nothing more than non-interference with natural rights. Once a virtuous person fully comprehends the non-aggression principle, the violence of the state becomes obsolete.